talking with the Board of Ed. We'll call this meeting to order. Can we all please stand for the pledge? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America,
and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, good evening. For the public, you may send your comments pertaining to an agenda item before or after the meeting to the following email, bof@fairfieldct.org. And as you would in a public meeting, please include your name and home address with your comment. If you email, excuse me, Jennifer Carpenter at jcarpenter@fairfieldct.org by noon on the day of our meeting, you will be able to make a comment during the meeting pertaining to an agenda item. At that time, you will receive a WebEx instructions via email. So, good evening, Board of Ed. And we have with us is Mr. Cummings with us.
Hi, good evening. Mr. Cummings is trying to actually get into the meeting. He's having trouble logging into the WebEx.
Okay. Well, we have Mr. Cummings joining us, and we have the Executive Director of Finance and Business Services, Doreen Munsell. We have the Executive Director of Special Education and Student Services, Robert Mancusi. We have Executive Director of Operations and Processes, Dr. Parrish. We have Executive Director of Personnel and Legal Services, Title IX Coordinator, Attorney Deasy. And we have Executive Director of Operations, Mr. Angelos Papageorge. We have the Board Chair, Ms. Christine Batali, with us as well. So, do we wait for Mr. Cummings? We can certainly wait. Silence is okay.
Yes, this is Zakia Parrish, Executive Director of Operations and Processes. Yes, if we are able to wait for him, we are trying to troubleshoot why he's not able to get into the meeting.
Yeah. I'm going to run down right now and see if I can help him.
Okay, so for the public, we're just going to take a couple of minutes and wait for our superintendent, Mr. Mike Cummings, to join us.
I apologize, everybody. I'm here.
Okay, good evening, Mr. Cummings.
Sorry about that.
Not a problem.
I'm in a building full of tech people.
Yes, I know the feeling. So we made our introductions. Mr. Cummings, thank you for sending over the PowerPoint earlier. We had this afternoon to review, so we will turn it over to you and your team. And after you finish your presentation, I'll let the board ask questions or make some comments in regards to the presentation. And then we'll go over to the budget book and go through some of the highlights of the budget. Ms.
Okay.
Vitale, you'd like to make a comment before we start?
Thank you, Mr. Brown. Yes, I would. Christine Vitale, Chair of the Board of Education. I want to thank you all for having us tonight. I'm looking forward to presenting the Board of Education budget along with the superintendent and our executive directors. The budget before you represents a 5.19% increase over the current year's spending. That includes the $2.5 million funding that is currently being funded through the non-lapsing account and a transportation. That money for next year will be returned to the operating budget. As I'm sure you know, the Board of Selectmen further reduced our budget request by $2 million, bringing it to a 4.11% increase. We're looking forward to presenting the budget tonight, explaining some of the initiatives that will be moving forward next year, and just sharing how we plan to get us past this pandemic. We're looking forward to the year ahead, and this budget is one of the first steps. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to the superintendent, who has the PowerPoint presentation ready to show.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Thank you, Ms. Vitale. And again, good evening, everyone. Mike Cummings, I apologize for the delay. I'm going to share my screen and go through the presentation with you, speak to that a little bit, and then as Mr. Brown said, we can go through questions related to the budget, the presentation, certainly to the budget. So let me do to this. And let me go to the presentation. All right, do you see the presentation there?
Yes, we do.
Nope, hold on. Okay. There we go. All right, my computer's moving slow tonight, so very slow. My goodness. All right, here we go. All right. So really quickly, as I said, I'll just go through the slides and try to present the high level engagement here around what we're presenting to the Board of Finance tonight. Certainly one of the things we've learned over the past year that absence makes the heart grow fonder, as it were. The difficulties we've had with the pandemic and bringing students to school, one of the things that's certainly been clear is that people have spoken on both sides of this issue, be back in school hybrid or to be remote. They've shared a common understanding of the value of the school system to them and to their students and their children. So that certainly has become more clear this year than it perhaps ever was. So we are challenged in going forward, not only by this recovery of the pandemic, but the existing challenges that are facing the school system that we'll talk about on the next slide. So really what this budget is intending to do is invest in these different issues, social emotional learning in light of the pandemic, but as we'll talk about in a little bit, this has been an ongoing issue in the school system for a number of years. And this year has only exacerbated some of those longstanding concerns that we have for student and well-being and mental health. We're going to talk about an investment in early literacy and the Literacy Academy that follows in a number of years of efforts by the school system to integrate the needs of high needs learners into the schools, into our processes and planning as an effort to do what's best for students, but also in the long term reduce expenses for the district. We'll talk briefly about our effort to promote racial equity. There's one small budget item this year that's included in that, but a lot of that work is outside of the budget and will continue. The work that we continue to do around SRBI to support the needs of all learners is taking on even greater need in light of concerns around learning loss that have been intensified by the pandemic. Invest in the HVAC and air quality, which has been a longstanding request of the board, and restore funding to each of our schools for classroom supplies, materials, and activities. One of the things that we did in 2017 is we reduced the per pupil allocations at each of the schools. This year, we're making an attempt to restore it back to that level of funding in order to better support our teachers and principals in making some instructional resource decisions for the students in their individual schools. And we are going to be in the process of developing a district improvement plan, which we'll talk about further if there's questions, but certainly we were going to reach out to the Board of Finance and other elected town officials, other boards during the course of the next year to get your involvement and intake. Just a real quick overview of our student demographics. This is a slide we like to show each year. I want to, though, go to the next slide because this is an issue that I know has come up in previous Board of Finance conversations, and we wanted to provide some information and some clarity for you around this, and really even for our own sake as we look back on this. We haven't explored this data in a couple of years. But essentially, if you look at this slide, it's telling you a couple of things. That one, we're seeing an increase in the number of students that have been identified for special education services. The other thing that it's telling you is that we're seeing an increase in a number of the categories of disability that students qualify for. I want to take a step back and be really clear that we point this slide out, or we bring this data forward to highlight what drives a lot of the costs in the districts. And one of the things that I've learned, I think we've all learned over the past year, is that when these types of discussions take place, unfortunately, it devolves sometimes into an argument about us versus them and why this happens. And I think I speak for everybody here tonight that this is not the intent of bringing this information forward. The intent of this information is just to cast a light on one of the things that the district has been criticized for in the past few years, and that is, as enrollment decreases, why does staffing increase? And this slide and a slide that's further on in the slide deck will get into that issue a bit. But it's really, again, driven by the increase in the number of special education students and the areas of disability under which those students qualify. And later on this evening, I hope somebody asks Mr. Mancusi about this in a little bit more detail, because he is prepped and ready to go with a response to talk about this. But one of the things that we're doing in the district, what we've done in the district, is we really have worked to build internal capacity to address the needs of these students. And as I said, the Literacy Academy this year, in this year's budget proposal, is one further effort to do that. So I will go forward. But actually, before I do, I just want to point out, if you look at the student increase in rates, you'll see that last bullet and the sub-bullets underneath it, the changes that have taken place over across the district. And it's important to remember that for these categories of disabilities, these are often very costly categories. And what we've tried to do over the years is to reduce outplacing students because it's the right thing to do by those students, but in the long run, it also saves us funds. Our enrollment projection, again, you'll notice that the overall enrollment at the elementary is going to be expected to start to go back up in another couple of years. But the high school enrollment and the middle school enrollment will begin to decline, and the high school enrollment will be declining as well in the next decade or so. Budget trends over the past few years, which I think most people on the Board of Finance are very familiar with. And then I wanted to point this slide out. When we look at our budget versus actual student enrollment, certainly our budget is always driven, so much of our budget is driven by staffing in response to our student enrollment. And we'll talk about in a little bit some of the impacts that we've done over the years to address those issues and what has resulted in an increase in staffing. I also wanted to point out that per pupil, there's been a couple different per pupils put out lately, and this is the one that's actually drawn from the state information around per pupil spending from the state reports. So let's talk about the enrollment and staffing trends over the past few years. Excuse me one second. So one of the things you'll notice here, again, it has been rightfully pointed out that our staffing has increased as enrollment has gone down. And if you break this out a little bit, the total K-12 enrollment is in the gray, the regular ed enrollment is in the blue, the special ed enrollment has increased, as we talked about on the previous slide. And you'll see that over the course of these years, the trend is towards a 24% increase in special ed enrollment. So let's talk a little bit about how this has impacted staffing. We broke out on this slide essentially a historical timeline of what we've tried to do in the district since 14-15 to address student learning needs. And again, so much of the staffing in the district has been driven by, not all of it, but so much of it has been driven by needs to bring students back into the district and to support their learning inside the school system. So if you look at this, you'll see, for example, and it's, this is credit to Ms. Leonardi before Mr. Mancusi, and of course Mr. Mancusi since. The efforts to increase, for example, the placement of our CLC classes in each of the feeder patterns, the addition of a CLC, or what we call a TLC class at Riverfield, the impact program at the high school. These have all been efforts to respond to the growing number of students with high needs in the school system. And that is, again, if you think about any one of these CLC classrooms, you're talking about a staffing level that would include a teacher, a couple of ed trainers, and 2, 3, 4 paraprofessionals. I do want to point out that the district engaged in a special education audit a couple years ago. And one of the outcomes of that special education audit was to look at the staffing formulas for these classrooms and to go essentially to what we would call a triad model. In other words, one adult for every 3 students, the purpose of which is to increase independence for those students. And as a consequence would reduce some of the staffing involved. That was an effort that was underway in last year, but has been put on hold in response to the pandemic due to the learning needs of students. But that is something we're committed to coming back to in the fall of 21. There's also been a couple of regular ed initiatives. Back in 15-16 was the change in the high school schedule and the addition of the elementary world language in grade 3. And then we had since then the addition of the STEAM program and the elementary program facilitators, which has expanded our elementary enrichment program. So there's been a couple increases in the last 2 years, and certainly one proposed in our current budget for an additional health teacher at each of the high school, and that's in response to changing graduation requirements from the state. Let's talk about the good things in our budget. Then there's a lot of good things in the budget, although there's not an awful lot of dollars associated with these things. So the Literacy Academy that we're talking about next year, and the board recently received a presentation on, in fact, it was last Tuesday. Mr. Mancusi is available tonight to talk further about that. Again, this is about building our teachers' capacity to address the severe reading needs of students and at an early age, with the goal being that, again, keeping these students in school, remediate their learning needs here in Fairfield, and then ultimately support their improvement in reading, but then reduce outplacements that are costing us a lot of money right now. Elementary social workers, this is a reallocation of staff. But again, and I want to be really clear on this. This need existed before the pandemic. The elementary principals have been asking for an increase of social worker support at the elementary due to a number of anxiety, stress situations that our kids are finding themselves in at a very early age. The proposal that we have includes an additional day per week, or 0.2 FTE, for 9 of the 11 elementary schools. 2 of the schools, Holland Hill and McKinley, already have full-time social workers, so this would go to the other 9 schools, giving them an additional day a week. And the equity program is the third bullet. That's a teacher residency program that we're working to get involved with to identify an elementary teacher in training, provide them with a mentor, essentially a residency tuition program so that we can increase the diversity of our instructional staff. In further efforts to reduce costs, we want to provide a stipend for physical management training. Currently, we contract out for that. That comes with a cost. It also comes with the limited availability of the trainers. We believe that by training people in the district to do that, we can reduce the cost, but also increase the availability of people to train, as we do hire staff who require this training throughout the school year. And at the high school, we've added this past year, for the current year, essentially department chairs at each of the two high schools. We want to supplement them with both a special education and an SRBI coordinator for the two high schools. We have work to do at our high schools to increase support for students at the level, and we need to do a better job at supporting students when they need interventions and support. And finally, the indoor air quality and preventive maintenance. We've upgraded and will continue to provide the MERV 13 filters in wherever possible in our school system. But again, we want to add a preventive maintenance program to our air handlers and our air systems in order to reduce further repair costs. And this is, again, part of the efforts in the district to invest in keeping up our infrastructure and not let it fall into disrepair. Back to the dollars. This, as the Board of Finance well knows, we've had conversations about this going back now almost a year. The impact of the budget this year in yellow there is highlighted in these two areas: the operations and maintenance of buildings and transportation. This was driven by the routing of the money last year into the non-lapsing account. So you see an additional or a higher increase in those two categories, which is further explained on the next slide. So again, if you look at operations and maintenance and transportation, those account for, of our 5.19% request, they account for 1.56 of that. If we wasn't for the non-lapsing, the take on those would have been 0.17%, and the request would have been 3.76. But the non-lapsing account, which we all agreed to, that's where those two accounts were impacted by that agreement. As we look at this, the drivers here are highlighted in yellow. Again, operations and maintenance and transportation, but now joined by staff salaries and benefits. It leaves, of the 5.19% request, 0.71% is in those other areas down below the yellow. And so when we talk about a $2 million cut, as we look at that, we're going to be trying to avoid as much as possible the little additional funds that are requested in things like supplies and text and materials, other purchase services, those types of things. And we're going to be, as the board knows, we're going to be looking at the drivers. Transportation really is not a place where we can cut. We're hesitant, as always, to cut infrastructure in our buildings. I think we know what has happened when that has happened in the past, and we don't want to repeat those mistakes. So there is going to be an impact on staffing as a result of any cuts to our proposed budget. And again, just we've searched for the right graphic. I understand this might be the one. I'm always welcome to hear the opinion of others, though. So if anybody wants to comment on this one, but this essentially is our attempt to visualize what took place last year with the non-lapsing account, and how the funds were reallocated into the funds were essentially saved last year to support the budget of the current year, 2021. But I point this out because we wanted to talk about the 3-year average of expenditures, and when you put those three together, and in looking at in line with past budget increases, the 3-year average falls in line with past expectations that we've done. One last thing, the last bullet here. One of the things that's been raised is responses to the operational audit. I can send you this PowerPoint. You'll find that those links, responses to that operational audit that Prismatic did in 2010. Dr. Title, Dr. Jones, and myself have since responded to those with, as I said, most of those suggestions have been implemented. And as I said, there's also been an additional special education audit. that was done 2 years ago, and we're implementing from those recommendations as well. So, Mr. Brown, that's the end of the presentation. I can leave this up if there's any questions now that reference this. Otherwise, I can shut it down. But given my state of technology use tonight, I'm hesitant to shut it down if anybody wants to refer back to any of the slides we've looked at.
Okay, we'll leave it up there for now, Mr. Cummings, until we move on to the budget book. Before I turn it over to the board, Mr. DeWitt did want me to apologize for him. He has a family commitment tonight with his son, so he cannot join us, but we will update him and he'll have an opportunity to ask questions. The rest of the board is here. And again, thank you for your presentation. And I will turn it over to the board. I just can't see the whole board at once with that up, if that's okay.
No,
I'll
I'm
scroll
sorry.
through. So I'll just turn it over to the board for questions or comments. And just give me Mr. Walsh. Excuse me, Mr. Walsh, you're on mute.
Thank you, Chairman Brown. Mr. Cummings, thanks for the presentation and thanks for your Ms. Vitale, Mr. Papa George, Dr. Parrish, and Ms. Munzel for being here this evening. I'm just going to go through pages that I had written down notes in reviewing your presentation tonight, so maybe I just get some questions answered.
Sure, Mr. Walsh.
About it. So I'm just going to be popping around to different pages. And Mr. Brown, as I do so, I don't know if people want to ask questions about the same page. I'm willing to let people jump in before I move to the next page. So
Okay, thank you, Mr. Walsh. I just had to take myself off mute. So I'll, before we go on to the next page, I'll check with other board members if they have questions on the same page. Thank you.
Okay. On page 3, you talk about your focus is going to be on the well-being of the whole child, and I looked at your bullet list.
Yep.
What things are you going to be doing to promote racial equality? Racial equity, excuse me, I'm reading from your form.
Thank you, Mr. Walsh. I appreciate that question. It really, the budget impact is on that teacher mentorship program, but I will tell you that we, a lot of the work we're going to do, particularly in 21-22, does not have necessarily a budget impact. We're looking at two primary issues. One is the professional learning for staff. When people engage in this work, a lot of it begins with reflective conversations almost with self to understand where people are, what their backgrounds are. That's a lot of the work that we would have to do with staff as well. We are looking at the potential of some train-the-trainer type models of professional learning. We are going to be looking at grants, other ways that we can finance this in the first year of implementation. And of course, we've got to balance this with the professional learning we need as educators to improve our instructional practice. So not that those two things are separate from each other, they actually are supportive of each other, but that's how we look at it. The other piece that we would wind up spending time on is we need to work on some curriculum review. We do that naturally as part of the curriculum process. We're in the middle right now of a math curriculum review. We're going to be starting the English Language Arts K-12 review next year. So as part of that review, examining our own curriculum, does it reflect the diversity of our community? Does it reflect the diversity that we want our kids to encounter in their education? Those are all questions that we need to ask as we go forward.
Okay. At the bottom of page 3, you say you're going to be developing a district improvement plan to drive the future of the district and move past the pandemic. Do you have a plan on how you're going to be moving past the pandemic, or is that something that's going to be you're going to be working over the next, I guess, until September?
Oh, I have a lot of thoughts on how do we get past the pandemic, but no, I presented to the board in March, and we're going to be revisiting at our April 6th meeting is essentially the first steps of kind of a timeline for how we're going to do the district improvement plan. One of the things that we want to get involved with staff in the last 3 months of the school year is an assessment of where students are, where deficits have appeared, where they might have widened, but at the same time, we've seen some places where student learning has strengthened. So we've kind of need to do a needs assessment for our kids. We also need to take a look at what teachers valued in changes in their instructional practice and what they want to keep forward, keep going. So we have two things to really work on. One is identifying how we're going to support student learning loss, and the other is how we're going to support our teachers as they move forward in their instructional practices based on things that they've learned from teaching during this time.
Okay. And have you put funding in your budget that the Board of Education passed to pay for that and to pay for what initiatives are going to come out of that? Is there money in this budget that was not there before?
No, we didn't, and the reason we didn't was when we constructed the budget essentially in the late fall, we didn't have a time. We were not at. Well, I guess I would characterize our time right now as a bit more optimistic than it was in December, but we weren't in a place right then to think about that we'd be accelerating so quickly through the vaccination process, for example. But the other thing that we were hesitant to do is commit funding in the budget to, say, a summer school program that we might not be able to hold, or an after-school program that we might not be able to keep. I think we see some, we recognize that in both the ESSER II funding and the relief plan funding, that there are expectations in both of those funding sources to address learning loss in students, and that's where we would be looking to implement programs.
Okay.
Or funding for programs.
Okay. And how are you going to, with the plans that obviously you don't know what you're going to do yet.
Mm-hmm.
I totally understand that. But, I mean, how do you know what that's going to cost and how you're going to pay for it?
Well, I think one of the things we have to do is we have to identify the needs of the students who are, students who would be, identify students who would need this program. The other thing we're going to have to look at is the accessibility of those students. The best of intentions with a resource, or a remediation plan is often waylaid by it's summer or it's after school, and the kids that you want aren't the kids that are going to necessarily be available. So there's some work we're going to have to do to support those students' access to school, things like transportation, perhaps providing lunch. Those are the types of things we're going to have to look at, and that would be part of the funding that would come from those grants. I do believe in those grants, there's enough money to support the type of program that we'd be looking at. I do believe that that's going to be possible, especially if in the relief plan now, that to be realistic about this, the program would probably take place over at least a couple of summers, as that funding will allow funding through, I believe it's 2024.
From speaking to your central administration staff, getting reads from teachers, whatever, are we talking like 100 students, 1,000 students, multiple thousands of students that are going to need support?
I would say that one of the things we'd have to target is certain grade levels. So where are we going to essentially place our bets around say early literacy, or let me broaden that, say literacy? Would it be in K1, 2? Would it be in the transition years between 5 and 6 and say 8 and 9? Those are the things that we have to look at. It's not to say that students in other grade levels we wouldn't look to support in some ways, but I think in order to do this work really well, we have to have a very targeted approach, because one, it's going to require some training for our staff, and we probably aren't. If we try to do everything for everybody, I don't think we're going to meet the level of success that we really need to set. So where those transition years, those early literacy years, are the key years to support student needs. And I want to also clarify, I haven't spoken to this directly, and I need to, that part of this is not only what we provide the students, but it's also going to be about the training that we can provide the schools to better meet the needs of kids. So I'll take a step back. One of the things that we've thought about, and again, at this point, you know, we're only thinking these things, but one of the things that we were thinking about was, would it be, should we think about some type of building support to help schools identify the intervention process more quickly, plan intervention programs more rapidly, and provide coaching to teachers to implement those programs effectively. Those are the types of things that we're looking at. So when the money essentially is gone, do we leave behind an improved ability of our staff to meet the needs of kids? You know, I've seen in the past where intervention programs, funding comes along, funding goes away, and if you were lucky enough to be in school at that time, you benefited. But if you came after that, no luck.
Yeah.
We want to be able to leave in the wake of these funds an improved instructional program, and that starts with the staff who are going to be there after the kids matriculate up.
Thank you for that. And you mentioned the literacy programs, and obviously that's very important, but you also were forthright, I don't know, in the last month or two, when I asked you a question about where students are falling behind, and you said math, and because
Yes.
you stated that's a subject matter that kind of needs to be practiced on a daily basis, kind of. I don't mean to put words in your mouth, but
No, that's true.
is that going to be a source of areas where you're going to have to provide additional support to students, or is that just something that once they're back in school now and they're going to start picking up and you're just going to have to try to catch up with your program?
No, I would say that to you that math belongs with literacy. Those are the two primary areas. I think that math, I've seen math benefit from a summer program that's essentially targeted with providing students, you know, what they're missing in a four-week burst of half-day instruction, and that can not only remediate kids, but it can also accelerate kids. And those are both things that we really have to set as goals.
Okay. You probably saw this headline last week or so. I found it very interesting. Mike Bloomberg came out with some statements in regards to education on how people should catch up, and suggested that the entire country should basically go to summer school, continue, not take the summer off as a way of catching up. Has the district considered any of that?
We haven't considered it for everybody, but I think that summer school offers a lot of possibilities. You know, you have to be deliberative in the time. You know, I think if it tries to go too long, you run. People need a break, but I think we all need a break. But I would suggest that that a strong summer school program that is individualized for student learning needs has the potential to really be very successful. My only concern with it is it's at this point it's essentially an optional program for parents and students, and you know our experience has taught us that we don't always get the students we most need into those programs.
So there's no talk about doing it for everybody. It's just you're looking at more of a targeted program to certain students for certain subjects.
That's correct.
Or needs. Okay. I'm done with page 3. I'm going to move on to page 4. Mr. Brown, unless anybody else has any.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Walsh. I have Ms. Marmion. If you can go back there.
Yep.
I just want to point out to the Board of Finance, if you want to send me a chat and let me know you have a question, that'll be beneficial while this presentation is up. So, Ms. Marmion? Sheila, we can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, I apologize. I just want to go back to what Mr. Walsh was talking about in terms of summer school. And I understand that you have not yet determined, how many students or what the cost would be, and you're looking at grants, et cetera, have there been discussions with other districts close to Fairfield in terms of regionalizing or sharing the cost of what summer school might look like, so that it wouldn't just be Fairfield students, it might be, other towns close to Fairfield where we could share resources in terms of teachers and maximize efficiencies?
We haven't had those discussions yet. I will tell you that I think all of us are in the same spot right now, with the grant applications for ESSER just essentially landing on our desk within the past week or two. We've not advanced. I mean, I speak to the superintendents, the area superintendents every Friday. We've not yet advanced to that type of problem solving right yet.
Is the district, is Fairfield open to such a discussion? I mean, is it something that you would, once you get, your feet wet and understand these grants, is it something that you think will come up in conversation with the other superintendents? And would you yourself as a superintendent be open to that sort of discussion, looking at these efficiencies?
Oh, absolutely. I think one of the ways that this potentially could work is, each district were to take on, say, a different grade or a different need. We'd have to look obviously at the cost. I mean, I'm about to say that we'd have to look at the transportation costs, but given what we know now about technology, that may not be so much of an issue as it used to be in the past. So these are things we'd have to work out. But yeah, I'm absolutely open to this idea.
Okay, and when, just from a timing standpoint, when do you kind of think that you'll get your arms around this grant and kind of put a more solid plan in place?
That grant is due like in 3 weeks, so we'll be doing this pretty quickly. The ESSER 2 grant is due then.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Ms. Marmion. So we'll go to Mr. Bateson and then Mr. Mottola. Mr. Bateson?
Thanks, Jim. Mike, I got a quick question on, I say in the bottom of the page, district improvement plan. Do you foresee anything in your mind's eye that is going to come out of that is aimed at saving money?
I do. I think that has to be essential. So two things, Mr. Bates. And one I would tell you that one of the commitments I've made in the district improvement plan would be that, the plan is, I think, is a 5-year plan. One of the commitments I have is that we would cost out anything in that plan over the course of those 5 years. So if, let's say we were to engage in professional learning around racial equity, right? We would determine what that cost would be, and we would include it in the plan so that the Board of Education and all the other town bodies had an understanding of what we were essentially committing to. But one of the components of our district improvement plan would at the same time be seeking efficiencies, looking at ways that we can reduce overhead and do different types of cost analysis and adjustments, because we recognize that we've got to find corresponding savings wherever possible.
Good.
So the district improvement plan won't go forward without one of the initiatives in it being improving our efficiencies and our expenditures.
Good, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Bateson. Mr. Mottola?
Thank you. Hi, Mr. Cummings.
Good evening.
I appreciate what you're saying about getting students help. The thing I always have trouble figuring out or determining, and I'm sure you're having trouble doing this, is how do you know which kids need help? I mean, we just went through a pandemic year. I would imagine there are a boatload of kids who are going to need help. And how do you identify those kids for some program that is 3 months away for this summer? Or is this something that's going to have to be over a 2 or 3 year period?
It's a great question. Where we are, I think there's 2 answers to that. One is the right now, and the right now would be that we are in the process of, we give our STAR assessment in reading and math to students in K-8. we're in the process right now of analyzing the late winter, early spring assessment and identifying students that are going to need additional supports. So we have that current information, but I think that what we're talking about is that there are going to be students who are going to need supports for multiple years. You know, what they may well have needed supports prior to a pandemic, but we're not going to necessarily be able to catch them up in, say, a 4 or 5 week summer school session. It's going to take time to be able to do that, and part of that planning isn't just, say, a summer school or an after school program. It's the work that happens in the classroom itself when students return in September for 180 days. You know, that work has to be part of just normal day-to-day instruction.
Right. So things for the next school year that starts in September, there could be a scenario where, based on testing that you've given and research, that you're going to have to supplement the curriculum so students can catch up. Is that a fair statement?
Yes.
Okay. All right. I mean, that's all I have on this slide right now. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Mottola. So if we could just go to page 4, Mr. Cummings.
Yep.
And I'll go to the board. Any questions from the board on page 4? Mr. Walsh.
Mr. Cummings, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. Just 2 numbers I kind of want to ask you about and
Sure.
what you think would be a bit of a trend. The EL students, while it was, at least the number showing here, it was kind of going up 2 years in a row, it's now coming down 2 years in a row by a decent clip. Is there a reason that's happening, or is it just not enough sample size and number of years to see whether this is a trend or just an aberration?
Mr. Walsh, we've looked at that question ourselves, and we're not sure what is causing that. It seems to be falling in line with kind of a regional trend, and I'm saying that more anecdotally than the data I've seen. Superintendents have talked about this, but as to the cause, I do not know.
Okay. And then on the bottom right-hand corner, the high school graduation
Yes.
rate, I know it's only 1 year and it goes back to 2018, but you don't have your own graduation rates for the other years?
Beyond the last year, for example.
Yeah, it's really only 1 year for last
Yeah,
year.
we just got it from the state, but we're in the process of verifying it, so we didn't put it up because we haven't been able to verify the number yet.
Okay. And was that just an aberration, you believe, that 1 year that went down, or is there?
Well, one of the challenges with this, so this is the 4-year graduation rate, and one of the things that honestly I struggle with the state around this, and I want to be clear, there are students in Fairfield Public Schools who don't graduate in 4 years because they drop out, they take a different course of action. But one of the things that impacts this number, not just in Fairfield but across the state, is there are students who qualify for services if they're special education students up until their 22nd birthday now. They don't graduate in the course of those 4 years. So depending on those students, that's going to have an impact on your 4-year graduation rate. You still have those students in the school system. I can tell you for quite a number of years, superintendents have said to the state that this really isn't a fair and accurate representation of what's happening in the schools, but I believe this is a federal definition that the state uses, and nobody's listening. So that's why that number, to some degree, that's why that number is where it is.
Okay, thank you for explaining that.
Yeah.
I have no more questions on this slide.
Okay, I'm not seeing any further questions on this slide. So, Mr. Cummings, if we can go to slide 5.
Yep.
And I scroll. Mr. Mottola.
So thank you for this slide. So, and I think you've said this over the years, your staffing has increased because of special education costs and needs going up. But what you're trying to do is, if I'm understanding you, is you're trying to build internal capacity to address this. In other words, you're trying to hire staff to address this because if you have to take care of these students one way or the other, and if you hire staff internally, you believe that that's a way in the long run to save money. Is that a fair statement?
That is a fair statement.
And then I think, I'm not going to jump ahead, I'll get to it when I get to it, but I think you had an example of that in a slide that's like 5 or 6 pages away. I'll wait till we get there.
Yep,
But-
that's correct.
So that's what you're trying to do, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, and you have to take care of these students. You're mandated to do so one way or the other, either to outsource the students and spend money doing that, but what you've been trying to do over the last several years is bring these students back, hire staff. Yes, it increased our staffing needs, but in the long run, and maybe currently, it is saving money for the district.
That's correct.
Okay, all right. That's all. I just wanted to clarify that. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Mottola. Mr. Walsh?
Mr. Cummings, thanks for this slide. I appreciate it. Kudos to you for putting it in because it kind of helps us, I think, visualize the different disabilities that make up, some of the programs you're talking about. So I found it very helpful to look at that. So I guess the question is, are these numbers going up on this chart over time based on and it might be some combination. Obviously, there's some mandates that get added, like the dyslexia mandate. The state added the dyslexia to specific LDs that you point out in another slide back in 2014, 15. So is it more disabilities are being identified and you're being required to give services for, or are we just getting better at identifying some of these disabilities that we were supposed to take care of before, or is there just growing areas in certain of these disabilities for whatever reason that you might not know about?
Thank you, Mr. Walsh. It's a really good question. I think probably the best person to answer that, Mr. Mancusi, if you're there on deck, I think you're the best person to respond to Mr. Walsh's question.
Thank you, Mr. Walsh. Rob Mancusi, Executive Director for Special Education and Special Programs. It's an excellent question, and one I would say the answer is we certainly have improved our, our assessment skills to identify and, qualify students who meet the eligibility criteria. I will say across the state and the nation, the prevalence rates continue to increase. Ours a couple years ago in Connecticut went to 15% for the first time. Currently, the prevalence rate is at 15.6%. Fairfield, we're at 14.2%. We've consistently identified less students than the state average, but I will say, as you can see by this chart, the number of students who struggle with social, emotional, and psychiatric issues has significantly increased. Just in the 4 years I've been here, certainly the dyslexia legislation that came into effect several years back has forced us to improve the quality of our assessment and intervention. And then we'll talk a little bit about tonight about the Early Literacy Academy and where that is coming out of. And then I just targeted and showed some numbers here on this slide to show the increase over the past several years, because many of these students in these categories are students who, if we're unable to program appropriately for, in the least restrictive environment or within the Fairfield Public Schools. They're high-cost programs that we would need then to, pay outside tuitions on. I don't know if that answered your question.
I think it kind of does. I didn't expect you to be able to give me a point, for every single point. The reasons, it seems like it's a little bit of a hodgepodge of mandates of new things, and I thought you might say that it was you're identifying more students in these areas, but I just wanted to kind of hear what your response was. But it's an excellent slide to kind of see what's going on. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Walsh. Mr. Testani?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Sorry, a little technical issue. Just curious, Mr. Mancusi, on the slide where it says other health impairment, I believe it went from 101 to 104. What kind of disabilities fall into that category?
These are students who may have multiple kinds of medical disabilities. That could be somebody who has, a significant anxiety disorder, a significant, depression could fall under OHI before, the team determines that it would qualify as student for emotional disturbance. It also could include, a severe diabetic, or somebody with some other kind of medically fragile condition that impacts learning.
And thank you. And the others look like they're all clinically diagnosed. Is that fair to say?
I missed that question.
All the others, with the exception of perhaps the last one. So help me understand just a little bit. Maybe I'm just a little confused between that and multiple disabilities. So
Multiple
other health
disabilities,
impairments, right? And then multiple would be autism and ADD, perhaps, or is that
correct. Multiple
Okay, gotcha.
disabilities is a student who is intellectually disabled and has another disability along with the intellectual disability that significantly impacts, performance across all areas.
Okay, very good. Thank you for helping me understand that. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Testani. Mr. Cummings, let's go to page 6, slide 6.
There you
I'll
go.
see any questions on slide. I'm sorry, I missed Ms. Charlton. Ms. Charlton, you have a question on the last slide?
Yes, thank you, Chairman Brown. Just a quick question for Mr. Mancusi. This slide is really terrific to help understand what the cost drivers are. Is this a phenomenon that is consistent with other towns in our areas or across the state, to your knowledge?
Absolutely. Yes, it is.
Okay, that was it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Charlton. Okay, slide 6, Mr. Cummings, on enrollment projections. Any questions from the board on enrollment projections? Seeing none, we'll go to slide 7. Any questions on the budget trends? Seeing none, we'll go to slide 8. I think we covered this then, right? Go to slide,
Hold on.
Mr. Walsh?
So, Mr. Cummings, slide 8. In the graph that's there,
Yeah.
You explained a little bit on why the town appropriations are kind of going up, even though the student population has been decreasing earlier. But it's kind of amazing because the line between town appropriation and BOE requests are almost on top of each other. Meaning that if you would have told me that this was my investment, my investment advisor told me that this is where he thought it was going and my portfolio went there, I'd be really happy with the way this is going.
Yeah.
So, which kind of then leads me to the right, where you start talking about cost per pupil expenditure and verse from 2011-12 to 2020-21, and then, you know, our state rank, because we've kind of funded pretty much what was requested throughout these years pretty closely. So I know there's been, you haven't done it in your presentation, but some of your predecessors have always gone to that per pupil expenditures and talked about what the state rank was, and some of them have claimed that it was a problem that where our state rank was. I question whether it was efficiencies in the system that caused that to occur, considering the educational system was doing pretty well and the students were performing pretty well. It's just kind of interesting because really, if you really wanted to increase that up, I guess the board would have to start requesting a lot more money in order to get there, because the town seems to be funding what is primarily, this chart shows, what's being requested of them. Correct?
Yeah, I would agree with that, Mr. Walsh. I think that you know, I know that when you look back over the years, there's been years where the request and the need haven't, or the request and the supply haven't necessarily matched up so well. But for overall, when you look at the trend over time, there is a very close approximation of those two lines. And, you know, I think that speaks to the commitment of the town to the school system. You know, and I think we all know, we won't get into it tonight because time is limited, but so much of what's impacting these costs are things beyond our, I don't want to say our control, but beyond the borders of Fairfield.
Yeah. Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Walsh. I'm not seeing any further questions on this slide.
Okay.
Again, it's helpful if you send me a chat if you do have one. We'll go to the next one. Enrollment and staffing trends. Questions from the board on this slide? Mr. Walsh.
I just want to, this is also I don't believe we've seen a form of this, slide 10. Maybe I'm on the second page of the enrollment and staffing trends. I'm sorry, I was at 10, or maybe you were on 9.
Yeah, we're on 9 right now.
Okay, that's fine. I have nothing on 9.
Okay, seeing no others, we'll go to slide 10. Mr.
Yep.
Walsh.
10 gets into this further.
Yes. So, thank you for providing this this slide. Once again, it just it's very illustrative of what's happened, and I like the way you did the you know, the different changes from the different years on what was driving some of this, because it's very helpful to be able to look back, because some of this stuff you kind of forget about after the budget year you've just left.
Mm-hmm.
So, but it kind of does show some of the, especially on the special education side, what were the reasons for some of this. The question I guess I have for you, Mr. Mancusi, is I know you stated that the CLCs and things like that and some of the programs you were bringing in-house were going to save money. And I see on the bottom left, it says increased special education and FTE to avoid outplacement, $12.5 million cost avoidance. So you're saying that there's a 12.5 cost avoidance that we just had this current year, you believe, from some of the programs you brought in-house?
What this is meant to, that number is meant to indicate is that with all the specialized programs that we have in district, if those programs were not in existence and we were unable to meet those students' needs, by building in-district programs to avoid outplacements, that is the salary savings in the cost of salaries for staff for in-district programs versus what it would cost for tuition out of district placements.
Okay. So that's where we're getting the bang for our buck on those, bringing those things in-house and paying for these extra CLCs as we've been adding them on over the last number of years, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Do you see that number growing, like on a yearly basis?
I don't see it decreasing. I will tell you in the budget there is. We did budget for a CLC, an additional CLC that we're opening at Dwight Elementary School next year based on the number of students that are moving into kindergarten from the preschool. Preschool numbers continue to increase. And then as those students move up, you know, we revise our adjust our staffing based on the number of students at each level in CLCs. So the short answer is I do not see that the need for that decreasing. It just depends on where the distribution of the number of students is at what level before we look at adding staff.
Okay. Great. All right, thank you. And if we could keep Mr. Cummings, this slide, continue it going in the future, it'd be great, because I think it just gives us better historical context when we're talking about these programs, and especially in regards to the special ed program. Thank you.
We will, Mr. Walsh. It was very helpful for us as well to go back through this.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Walsh. So I have Mr. Mottola, then Mr. Bates, and then Ms. Marmion. So Mr. Mottola, you're up first.
Thank you. So when you were talking about this slide in your presentation, I think I wrote this down. You indicated that the district had done a special education audit 2 years ago, and the audit concluded that there should be one adult for every 3 students, and that's a way to reduce staffing. But that's been put on hold because of the pandemic this year. Is that correct, Mr. Cummings?
Yeah. So the primary reason for this was from the student side. We wanted to be able to increase student independence. I think there's a tendency to provide students sometimes with too much support, particularly as they get older, and it may not be of their best benefit. But it does have a corresponding impact on reducing staffing. But that is on hold, Mr. Mottola, really in response to where we are right now.
Okay. So I know this might be hard to say, but that could be another way moving forward to save costs for the district. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, absolutely. That's a fair statement.
Okay. And excuse me, because there's so many, abbreviations, ECC, blah, blah, blah. What is CLC again? I'm sorry. I should know this.
No, it's okay. Mr. Mancusi, Complex
Yes.
Learner Cohort?
CLC stands for Complex Learner Cohort. Those programs are for students who have significant multiple disabilities, autism, nonverbal students who need assistance with, feeding and toileting, or who just have significant learning needs. So they'll need support, more intensive support in school.
Okay, and you're adding one of those to Dwight this year?
For the 21-22 school year, yeah. Dwight is, we're adding one at Dwight.
And that's just another means to bring in internally these services to hopefully save the district costs. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, it's really by starting up another program, you're avoiding having to place a number of students out of district.
Okay.
So yeah, it's plus, we do have to, there are mandates regarding least restrictive environment. So yeah.
All right, thank you. And like Mr. Walsh, I think this slide's terrific. So hopefully you keep showing this every year. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Mottola. Mr. Bateson.
Thanks, Jim. I just want to follow up with Rob on. I want to clarify what Jim Walsh was saying. I'm seeing the slide. I'm not used to these terms, cost avoidance. My takeaway from this slide is that we are achieving significant savings by doing this in-house to the tune of $12.5 million. Is that correct?
That's just staff salaries. That's not even including benefits or what transportation would cost if we had to transport to an outplacement. Yes, that's a cost avoidance annually.
Can you say that again?
That is an annual cost avoidance based on the salaries that we pay our staff. That does not include what transportation would cost. So it's the cost, we're saving additional costs on transportation for these students. Just to bring some more color to this, the average cost of like a complex learner cohort student that we don't, if we can't program for in district, based on the four placements that a lot of our students who we can't program for in district because of the severity and intensity of their needs, that's just an average of almost $144,000 per year. So by being able to build internal capacity, we're saving a lot of money, or we're avoiding a lot of additional costs to our tuition accounts.
Okay, so cost avoidance is cost savings.
Yes,
Okay, thank you.
thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bateson. Ms. Marmion?
Thank you. I'm trying to understand the same thing Mr. Bateson was trying to get to. So can you compare the spend that the district makes, spends on increased staff, for example, social workers, et cetera? What do we spend versus what we save? Does that make sense? So what's our cost to the district in terms of in our budget versus the cost avoidance?
What I would have to look at the spend versus the cost avoidance in terms of what it costs to run our in-district programs that we're talking about. The total cost of the in-district programs that we're referring to right now is about $7.7 million. If we didn't have the in-district costs, it would be about $20.1 million. That's where you get that cost avoidance of almost $12.5 million.
Okay, so that's helpful. So we're investing approximately $7.7 million into these programs. And by doing so, we're avoiding approximately $12.5 million additional costs, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. So when we go through the budget tonight, could you flag for us those programs and the spend that we're making to pay for them so we can really understand that? And I know you can't do that, but you likely can't do this, but potentially project what some of the cost savings or avoidance might be with those programs, if possible.
If you could articulate that request again, so I understand what you're asking.
Sure. As we go through the proposed budget, I'd like to be able to flag those programs, those investments, those spends that we're making, so that we're all clear in terms of where those investments are. And then if we could potentially extrapolate what the projected savings are for next year related to those costs.
I might need a day or two to be able to do that. In the budget, I believe it's listed in each school's FTE where these specialized programs are housed.
Okay.
Yeah, I believe that's correct, Rob.
Yeah.
As long as we can flag them as we go through so we know what we're talking about. And then I understand you might need a couple of days.
Okay.
But that would be very helpful as we look at the budget.
Okay. We'll do our best to do that as we go through the budget book.
Hey, thank you, Ms. Marmion. Ms. Charlton?
Thank you, Chairman Brown. I had a couple of the same questions that Ed and Sheila did, but and this is obviously the question of the night here, but on the $12.5 million cost of avoidance, I understand how you're getting it, but the way you've characterized it is that's what we're saving if we were basically doing nothing, if we provided no programming at all. And I guess my question is, we're not doing that. We've never done that. We've always had some, internal programming. We're trying to get better at it. What is that sort of cost avoidance been doing as the years go on? Are we saving more each year? Are we, because it's not a choice of doing all or nothing, right? And we just acquired Giant Step School, for example. So one of the things we talked about when we did that was we'd have an opportunity to bring more students in-house. So in terms of this past year and even built into next year's budget, how does that trajectory look in terms of, what we're doing to successfully bring more students in district versus outplacement?
Well, there's a couple things there. When you build in-district programs, the primary objective is to be able to keep students in district from being outplaced. Once students are outplaced, then it's a process of working with the family to demonstrate that we have the internal capacity now to return kids. And we do this. We do it all the time. But it's a lot easier when you have a program for a student prior to being outplaced. So that's where the cost avoidance comes in. We base our specialized programs like our complex learner cohorts, or even our middle school and our elementary school and high school impact for our most significant students with social, emotional, mental health needs. We do have caps on them so we can maintain the integrity of the programming. I can tell you, with the complex learner cohorts, over the past 4 years, we have been, because of increasing staff capacity to work with our most impaired students, we've been able to increase student, the classroom max from 8 students to 10 students. Now we were pre-pandemic, and once we're through the pandemic, like Mr. Cummings was talking about, implementing instructional dyads and triads so we can increase student independence. Because what we're finding is students are becoming too reliant on all the adult support, or that when they're leaving us or they're getting ready to leave us upon turning 22 when they age out, the adult service world does not provide that level of intense one or even 2-to-1 support. Some students are going to need that, and they will get that, but by and large, we need to continue to work on student independence, starting at 3 and working through 21. So that's where that initiative came from. Again, I don't know if that was a long-winded answer, if I answered your question.
Sort of. That was helpful. I guess, do you look at, for example, the percentage of students complex learners that we're able to keep in district, and do you measure that over time to see how we're doing?
Yes. I know what complex learners we don't have, like our really significantly impaired kids or really significantly mentally fragile kids. They're outplaced, and we still, they still are Fairfield Public School students, and we case manage them. So we're still working with the families, but I do know those numbers of students that we feel like we can't program for because of the severity and intensity of their needs. So we would go to PPT and make that decision.
But are you saying that we're getting better at doing this based on the data? Does the data suggest?
Much better. But again, it's some years you get some students who move to Fairfield, or some students who turn 3 that are really, really significantly medically impaired, cognitively impaired. So, as we get new students, the challenges are different based on year to year. But yeah, we are getting better at it, certainly, to be able to program for more complex learners in district.
All right, thank you for that. But the last thing I'd say, and it's maybe just more of a comment, this is really good information. And I recognize this is not all about cost, but Mr. Cummings alluded to the fact, and I think he's right, that there's, a lot of high level metrics that get tossed around in terms of enrollment and spending that don't really tell the story because all this data underlies those spending numbers. And I would just suggest that 12.5 million, to the extent that that's a back of the envelope number and doesn't include things like transportation, et cetera. I think it would be a good idea to get a better or a more accurate and full measurement of that number, and and pay more attention to this overall, because it is such a significant driver, and it matters. If we try to some have suggested keeping spending, flatter and basing it on enrollment. I think to the extent you have this dynamic, that's got to come out from somewhere, and it would likely end up coming from, the broader student population. So I just think these are really important numbers to understand, and I thank you for putting this together.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Charlton. Mr. Walsh.
I forgot to ask this question earlier because I had written it down on a post-it from tonight from Mr. Cummings' comments. And that's regards to the triad model. I know you said that would be coming back in the fall, but I'm just trying to figure out whether it's in the budget or not. I know you prepare your budget in the fall, like you spoke about earlier, and some of this stuff doesn't get in because you didn't know where you would be. So it may not be in there, or it may be in there. So can you just tell me whether the savings from the triad model are in the budget or not?
If I could speak to that, Mr. Cummings?
Sure.
Sure, Mr. Mancusi.
Sorry to interrupt and interject myself. That's the PD that we work with our contracted staff, with our CLC staff, on increasing the use of instructional dyads and triads and pairing students up or putting students in small groups of 3 when they're working on a similar similar goal or objective. That work has already started. That PD has already begun. And when COVID conditions, improve, that is, we're going to begin that work again.
Okay. So
to answer that question, as I put the para FTE in the budget, I can confirm that it is budgeted for next year with the model that we are hoping to go back to.
So the savings are in the budget.
The savings is in the budget through a cost avoidance, through not requesting as many additional paras to maintain a one-to-one student to staff ratio when appropriate. Students in Fairfield, and we provide them the support they're entitled to, but we limited our request for additional paraprofessional staff based on our ability to return to the dyad and triad model.
Excellent. That answers my question pretty straightforwardly. And Ms. Deasy, I didn't thank you for being here tonight earlier. I didn't know you were on the call, so thanks for being here as well. Okay, so I think that's all the questions I have on this slide. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Walsh. Mr. Testani?
Yes, thanks, Mr. Chair. Just a quick follow-up question to sort of along the lines of what Mr. Walsh was asking. So just so it's clear in my head, what we're talking about does not include paraprofessionals. Am I right with that? Or
the dyad and triad training that started is included in our contracted service. So that is already built into the service that we get for our CLCs.
meaning the paraprofessionals?
Yes, meaning the paraprofessional support and the professional development training for staff to be able to implement dyads and triads, and for paraprofessionals to be able to support that work under the direction of special ed teachers.
Okay, and I'm just curious, it's not really technically on the slide, but how do the grants factor into any of this? Or is that a whole separate slide?
The IDEA grants,
Yes, yeah.
we do get an annual IDEA grant. That a portion of that does pay for, you know, several things. Pays for equipment that student needs. It pays for some FTE. It pays for, you know, a lot of different costs, but that's separate from the board budget.
Okay, thank you. That was my question. Appreciate
Okay.
it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Testani. Seeing no further questions on this slide,
All right.
we'll move on to slide 11. Just giving it, seeing no questions, go to slide 12. Mr. Walsh?
Actually, it has to do with slide 11. The Early Literacy Academy, I see that it's a pilot program for 7 students. Is that 7 because we only have 7, or is that just a test program, so you're only going to start it off with 7?
Yeah, we're looking to start that small. So that is for 7 of students who are currently eligible for special education and our most significant, our students with most significant reading disabilities. So we're looking at students in grades 1, 2, and 3 for our start of our program, and that also includes, you know, some professional development for up to 30 teachers, in structured literacy, and that is including regular ed teachers to improve the quality of, you know, general education instruction in early literacy, as well as specialized instruction for special ed teachers, for students who are already identified.
Mr. Mancusi, if this is a successful pilot, do you have any estimate of how many students would potentially qualify for this in the district? Is it close to 7, or is it a lot more than that?
It's a lot more. Currently, we have, just in terms of students in the Fairfield Public Schools who are eligible for special education as dyslexic students, there's 87 of them. We currently have a number of them who are outplaced or have been unilaterally placed, and we're spending hundreds of thousands of dollars annually. So I'm excited about this program. It's one of the most things in this year's budget that I'm excited about, because I think it has significant cost savings and cost avoidance potential, you know, as we move on this focus year after year.
Okay. So if it's successful, you'll be able to, like, next year, tell us whether it's successful, and then come back. I guess you'll be asking for funds for expanding it, right?
Yes.
To have a full program?
Yes.
Okay. I'm not going to drill down any more on that. In regards to the next item under elementary social worker, you say you're reallocating staff. Are they these social workers that were doing other things, and now they're just going to be reallocated to this program?
Who wants to answer that?
Ms. Casey, do you want to speak to that?
So the word reallocate is a little confusing because we are reallocating some FTE from one budget line to another, which has been confusing to our budget this year. So we had a district account for several of our social workers, though they were servicing elementary schools. We moved their salary lines to the individual elementary schools, and so that's the reallocation. And then we also are looking to add additional FTE to those elementary schools as well.
Okay. So some of it is just taking it from one main line and putting it directly into specific elementary school lines, and then you are going to add, how many FTEs are you adding as part of this?
Does anybody remember offhand? It's a
I
total
was wondering
of,
if Doreen had that ready. If I can get it if I have a second.
yeah, it's a total add of 1.8 because it's 0.2 for 9 schools.
Okay. And while you're looking that up, it says to support elementary schools' social emotional needs. Are these needs based on COVID stuff, things, or is this just because of general social emotional needs that you're seeing in the elementary school prior to COVID?
Mr. Walsh, this has been a request from the elementary principals for a number of years. Going back to when I was elementary director 4 years ago, the concerns that we have around student social emotional mental health have just been growing. Certainly COVID has made these things. They've certainly shined a spotlight on it and made things. I think exacerbated things for some kids, but the level of anxiety among students has, and the struggles that so many of our kids are having, it's unfortunately just been rising.
Okay. All right, you can get back to me regarding the FTEs that are being added for this program. If you don't have it in front of you, I don't want to slow it down.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Walsh. Mr. Mottola.
I actually had a question on the next slide because I thought we were there.
Okay. Any questions on 11? I'm seeing none.
All right.
Wait, I'm sorry. Wait. Yeah, so we'll go to slide 12, teacher stipends. Mr. Mottola?
Yeah, on the indoor air quality preventive maintenance, this is kind of a loaded question, and I don't know if you're going to have the answer. So, do we know how much money we're going to be getting in the from the feds in the recovery? Is it the Recovery Act? I might be saying it incorrectly. And I guess the reason why I'm asking, do you know whether or not there's going to be money in there for the district to do things like upgrading air filter capacity, or maybe even, you know, putting air conditioning in some of our buildings? Do we have any idea about that yet?
Mr. Vitola, we have some understanding of, we've not got a lot of detail on the latest, on the Relief Act. But I will tell you that one of the issues that's been raised in that is that it's not that, I should say, it's not an expectation that money must be spent on air quality issues, but one of the potential uses of that funds for a district could be air quality issues. And as we look at our needs, that's certainly something that is an issue in Fairfield, and we should seriously consider that as part of our granting request.
Okay.
Mr. Brown, can I just jump in on that, Mr. Mottola?
Sure.
Just some of the information that we've received from the state on this, that they are looking to prioritize learning loss with this funding. So just in terms of the district doing a needs assessment and prioritizing what the needs are, focusing on learning loss needs to be high on the list, not to diminish the needs for HVAC, but just wanted to share that information. I believe we shared the information on the ESSER 2 funding, the backup that we received from the State Department of Education. If not, that we can forward that along just so you have a little more clarification on that, just what the state's priorities are with that funding.
The state's priority right now with that funding is to focus on learning loss because of the pandemic. But, and I know you don't know the answer to this yet, but there could be other uses for this money other than that is related to COVID.
Yes. They're good. There can be.
Air quality, okay,
There can be.
all right, all right. Okay, that's all I have right now, thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Mottola. Well, now that this funding came up for Mr. Mottola, we might as well stay on it for a little bit. Make sure there's not any other questions on this, because it's the information that's coming out. I mean, it's hard to follow. So is there documentation, anything we can go to, or what do you know about this current funding? How much it is, when we would receive it, and what would the parameters be around the funding?
So there's two buckets of funding right now. There's the ESSER 2 funding, which Ms. Munsell, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe you said the other day that application is due on April 5th. That funding includes, there's kind of four big buckets in that, and again, a district isn't required to spend money in all four buckets at all, or three or two. You know, districts have to make some decisions. One of those buckets is learning loss, to address the questions that we talked about earlier. Another would be, and I'm going to forget this now. Another would be COVID expenses related to PPE, air quality, those types of things. I don't remember if anybody else on the call remember the other two. I offhand, I'm sorry, I don't remember right now.
Social emotional learning supports.
Yeah, that's three.
I think HVAC, right?
And then HVAC.
Is
Yeah.
HVAC separate? Yeah, so those are the four. HVAC was separate from COVID. So those are the four kind of areas in that funding. Ms. Munsell, do you have that dollar amount in front of you?
For the ESSER 2, it's
Yeah.
1.27 million.
What's that again?
1.27.
Okay. So that's the ESSER 2. The relief funding, that's the funding that we've not yet received, and we don't have much more information about. The only thing I can tell you is there's three things I understand about it. One, that funding source could go to 2024, to the end of the calendar year 2024. That it's not supposed to be used by the state or towns to lower taxes. That's something else that I understand is in it. And the third thing was, and that was about 20% of that funding should be, related to addressing learning loss. Other than that, and that's the Board of Ed side of that funding, because I also understand that each municipality will also be receiving a separate set of source of funding around that act. So those are some of the determinations that once we get a better understanding of what the parameters are with that, we'll move forward on that grant request as well.
And is that a grant we have to apply for?
That's correct.
Okay. And any idea what we would apply for?
In terms of how we would spend it?
Or no, how much money we're talking about?
Well, we apply for everything. Yeah.
What's that total though? Is there a total or?
Ms. Mansell, it's 3.1 something?
3.15, yep.
Thank you.
Okay.
And again, that's, I think 3 calendar years, essentially that money would be spent out over, could be spent out over.
And the first calendar year would it be which budget season?
I believe it would be coming with this next year, this current year. The next budget cycle, I believe.
Okay. But you're still on
fiscal year 21-22.
Okay. And just my last question on this, if you know, when would you expect to have more information? Or can you apply for it right now? Are you in the middle of applying for this?
No, we've not gotten an application for that funding yet.
Okay.
Ms. Patel, have you gotten any more information on this? On the Relief Act?
No.
Okay. So that's what Mr. Brown, it took the state, it seemed to take forever to even get the information on ESSER 2. So I'm not sure yet when more information will be coming forth. But when we do, like we did with ESSER 2, we get any of those fact sheets or anything, we'll be glad to share them with everybody. And, and I think it probably, serves the town well to have further conversations. I believe one of the things that I understand is in this is you have to get stakeholder input to how you might spend the funds. So that's certainly something that the Fairfield Public Schools would engage the town with.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you. And just on the SR2, that was 1.27 over 2 years, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And that would be for this current 2021 and 2022.
That's our understanding, yes.
Okay, thank you for that. There are some follow-up questions. Ms. Charlton is first, and then Mr. Walsh. Ms. Charlton?
Thank you, Chairman Brown. Mr. Cummings, on either of these grants where the money is intended to be directed to learning loss, is it fair to say we don't have anything specifically allocated for learning loss per se in the current budget?
Yes, that's fair to say.
Okay, so we are relying on these grants to do that.
That's correct.
Okay, this could not, and I know the supplement versus supplant, generally how that works. My other question on the, we talked about air quality issues. Obviously maintenance type things are in our budget and since these funds can't, cover things that would already be in our budget or, and therefore be used to reduce taxes. Has there been any discussion or thought around, sort of, major infrastructure or using any of them? Could the money be available for some, more significant infrastructure projects? Is that possible?
That is possible. That is certainly possible. From what I understand, and I think, a couple of the articles I read were more on the municipal side of this, but yes, people are certainly considering infrastructure improvements.
So even if that was something, and I'm just making this up, but like air conditioning in a school or, that sort of thing, is that the type of thing that this is intended? Is that the type of infrastructure project we could be looking at with this type of money?
That's the type of thing that a town, again, this is all preliminary, but from what I understand, that is certainly something that a town or school system could consider.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Charlton. Mr. Walsh?
First to follow up on Ms. Charlton's last question. So in the funds that just went for the non-recurring bonding, which they haven't been bonded yet, there was those controls at some of the high schools that Mr. Papageorge explained to us. And you, Mr. Papageorge, when you explained it, you were talking about how you need to do all this manual stuff, and now these were like fancy Nest devices that you could program. Is that something that might qualify where we wouldn't have to bond it, but we could bond something else in its place? Like use it to pay for that, and then give you some other bonding for some other project you have on your long list, just like the town does for following years or something, where we could do something like that.
Mr. Bob George, I didn't mean to cut you off.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. I was just going to say, I know we did talk about that for the single high school, was the 1.7 that we requested the bonding for Ludlow High School. My concern with holding off on that bonding would be if it fell through, first of all, and second of all, if we are able to get the money to move forward, we could move another building that's in our waterfall forwards with this type of program.
That's true. Okay, so those will be all things you need to explore.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I guess for Mr. Cummings, for you and your entire staff, including, and she's not part of your staff, but Ms. Vitale, have you heard of anything you could spend the money on here? Because you've given kind of a laundry list between these two different funding sources for relief here that could pay for things that are currently in your budget, the budget we're looking at now.
I don't believe, Mr. Walsh, I'm not sure if that would be allowed. I think that's one of the questions we have.
Okay.
I'm going to just jump in also. My understanding is that it was not to supplant local funding, and also that it should not be used to fund something that you foresee needing to carry forward post whatever the time period is. So something like the social workers is something, was a need that was identified before the pandemic and is a need the district is going to have after the pandemic. So I would be hesitant to use the ESSER funds to fund something like that. Another thing that we haven't really talked about, and we're right now very optimistic with the vaccine, for the ESSER 2 remote learning staff development and the digital divide, if there's any other technology needs, putting more infrastructure investments into technology. If we still have to support remote learning next year, this budget does not include really funding for that. We're being optimistic that the number of remote learners will decrease next year. We are also awaiting some state guidance on whether or not they will be requiring districts to do it this year. So I myself am looking to this grant money as a possible funding source for that as well. And in terms of the MERV 8 and MERV 13, I think that we're moving forward are probably going to have to be making investments in just a higher level filter for HVAC systems moving forward, knowing what we've learned about airborne viruses. I don't know if that answers your question further or gives additional insight.
I'm not sure either, Ms. Vitale. So, but I guess they'll be the end of what you just said was these filters. Seems to me that might be something that could be paid for out of these grants, and you guys could use your money towards other things. I don't know how that would work because I don't even know whether you'd have to supply them with the approved budget that you guys approved, and then I know you have to work on it if money's cut and things like that. I don't know how they look at that, whether they go to a line by line item or how this works. But you know, I always find it interesting down in Washington. They always approve the money, and then it takes 6 months to figure out how we're going to rule you could spend the money. It's like I can't imagine that a corporation, you make the request for the money, but say I don't know how we're going to spend it yet, but just give me the money. It's kind of a weird process, but it's the process we have. So, all right. So, will you update us, I guess, as we go along on this?
Absolutely.
All right. What's the $633,000 grant that I've heard is out there that you may have been approved for that can be applied towards spending for the 21-22 budget?
Ms. Mansell, is that a figure that strikes your memory?
I think I think you're talking about half of the 1.2 million, which is the ESSER 2.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think they showed it over a 2-year period, so that's probably
is
what.
that what it is? Okay.
Right.
All right. But we don't have the rules on that either.
That's the grant that we're in the process of applying for.
Okay. Will we get half over 2 years, or could you spend the whole thing in 1 year? Do you know any of those answers?
I think their preference is to spend it over time.
All right.
So correct, Ms. Mansell, if you don't mind, Mr. Walsh, I think we've seen that in our quarterly updates as part of an expectation that might offset some of the balance for the Board of Ed. In other words, I think at first it was negative 1.3, right? You had to make up 1.3 million. Wasn't that 633 applied to help offset that on our quarterly meetings?
I don't think we applied it yet, but that is something we have to look at.
Okay.
Correct.
It's just a possibility.
Yes.
You're looking at that. And then 633, the rest of it for 2022.
Correct.
Okay. Mr. Walsh, back to you.
So we can use some of that money in this year's, not the one we're looking at, not the 21-22 budget, but we can use some in the 20/21 budget year? Because that's what we're looking at the deficit in. Is
Yes, I believe
2020.
that's the case.
That's my
believe that-
understanding.
Is that, I'm sorry, you both spoke over each
Yeah,
other.
I'll let
so
Ms. Mansell go. Go ahead, Doreen.
That's my understanding.
that we can use it for
That
this
it-
year. Yep.
It would be available this year.
Okay. And then would that be like all the 633 and then another 633 next year?
That I don't know. To what extent, I don't know. I mean, I was assuming that the entire amount would be available, but that's, like I said before, their preference is to spend it over time prospectively rather than
Okay.
currently.
Okay.
So,
And
okay.
go ahead.
Go ahead, Mr. Walsh.
And then when Ms. Vitale was good enough to split out, or I think you started, Mr. Cummings, what it could be spent for. You both kind of tag teamed on it, but you can use it for social and emotional support. Is that for stuff that we're spending money on right now in this year's budget? Social and emotional support?
When you say this year's budget, do you mean the current budget or the proposed? I'm
the,
sorry.
The current budget, 2021.
It could be used, so I'll give you a for instance here. If we had hired, this is my understanding, if we had hired additional school psychologists this year, for example, to address backups in testing, because we were closed for the 3 months at the end of the school year last year, and we were behind in our testing of potential special education students, or we provided additional social emotional supports, counseling for kids. My understanding is that the funding from the ESSER 2 grant could be used to backfill essentially for those outlays of salary. It could be used. Another example would be if the district spent, the money on the desktop barriers. It could be used for things like that.
Okay. All right. Senator Murphy's been very clear warning districts not to hire people with this money because it's not going to be around long, so you're going to be creating cliffs. So I just want to make sure we're all on the same page when you guys are spending this money to, we all understand cliffs, and we had cliffs with you that we're trying to cover for this year and trying to catch you up. And I think we want to try to avoid that. If I ever have to hear that word cliff again after a year from now, it'll be way too soon. So I would hope that we'd all work together, and I'm sure you understand. I can already tell, Mr. Cummings, that you understand what I'm talking about, and we'll keep an eye on that we're not hiring like permanent personnel and that we don't have funding for in the future.
Yeah, Mr. Welch, just so you know, I was an interim superintendent back in the ARA funding days.
Yeah.
And, the lesson we all were made aware of at that time, and I avoided in my work, but you're right, that money at some point dries up, and you can't be left, you can't be left holding things. And to the point I made earlier this evening about building capacity so that when the money does dry up, you're left with the benefits of the training or whatever else happened. That's how you have to really play this out. You have to play the long game with that funding because the funding will not be there.
Yeah, great. Thank you. That's all the questions I have for right now, Mr. Brown.
All right, thank you, Mr. Walsh. Mr. Bateson.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. I just want to follow up. Jim Walsh pretty much summarized how I feel. I just want to get across to Mike in central office. I'm starting to feel a little pressure on this situation for the simple fact that this board is now on the clock. And, the farther along we're going in this process, I keep expecting to hear some concrete answers. And I know we're dealing with the federal government. I know we're dealing with the state government. And we all know that they have absolutely no answers to anything. But these are significant dollars between, tens of millions we're expecting from federal government. These are numbers that move the needle. And I'm worried that, I'm seeing now that, our decision process is coming to an end in a couple of weeks. And I'm afraid I'm not going to have any concrete answers then. based upon what I'm hearing now. And I just, I find that very frustrating. I appreciate Jim Walsh drilling down and getting to these, but I'm just starting to get a little frustrated with this process and figure out how we're going to spend this money, because this is money that if it's given to, I want to see it applied. So I don't know, getting a little frustrated here. That's just a comment I have.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Bateson. Yeah, I know that Ms. Kupchak had a conversation with Congressman Himes, and that might have been about the town money, maybe the Board of Ed as well, but specifically the town. And getting information is very, very tough, because they basically just passed it and got to go from them to the state to us. If we get answers within the next 2 weeks, I would be the most surprised person in the state of Connecticut.
I know, me too, Jim. Can I follow up one thing with Miss Vitale that I heard that kind of caught my interest?
Sure.
You had mentioned the Remote Learning Academy and a possibility that it might be around next year. What circumstance would you foresee that happening under?
Well, I'm talking about just supporting remote learners. The state right now for this fiscal year has pretty much told school districts that they have to offer a remote learning option to school districts. We don't know what the expectation will be for next year.
But we haven't been told that we have to offer it next year in the budget we're contemplating here.
We did not build in for a remote learning academy for the budget before you right now. We're assuming that.
Okay, but you're seeing that the state could turn around and say, you must offer it. That's why you're keeping that conversation open?
Well, just right now, the state is considering a lot of things that could potentially have cost impact. Unfortunately, sometimes decisions that impact districts that come with a price tag, high price tag, are made after we pass our budget. So that is a question mark for districts. I don't know if Mr. Cummings has any additional information, but we're still waiting guidance on that. And this, not saying that we're going to need to do it or have to do it, but this funding would be a resource to help support that. I think we just don't know.
Yeah.
Mike, do you have any foresight on this, where you think this is going?
I will tell you on the, we have a weekly call with the Department of Public Health and the State Department of Ed. That was every Tuesday morning. I was on that call this morning. The interim commissioner, Ms. Russell Tucker, was on. Somebody asked her this very question. And I want to broaden it out for 1 second, Mr. Bateson, because it was the idea of remote learning, not necessarily a remote learning academy. But as you know, like in our high schools right now, the kids at home are remoting into the existing classroom. So that's an option as well. She was asked if where the state was in the decision-making process. She replied that they're actively looking at that question right now. I then read an article in the Current this afternoon where she and the governor were, I believe, in Windsor, South Windsor, someplace up there, East Hartford maybe, and they were talking about the possibility, and that at least the way the article was written, it sounded like they're leaning towards requiring it next year. The governor even said that in his comments on this visit. So, but again, that could mean simply that you're offering students at home the possibility of remoting into the existing classrooms, and you're not doing a remote learning academy like we did. Those would be the considerations we'd have to look at over the next couple months.
Okay.
So I think they're getting closer. They just can't get here quick enough.
Okay, thanks.
Yep.
And Mr. Bateson, can I just follow up? Just the tens of millions of dollars that you reference in terms of the federal aid, I do think that a lot of that money is targeted to the town and not directly to the school district. So just in terms of reviewing our budget, as Ms. Munsell said, I think it's 3.1 for this next round of funding.
Yeah.
That's coming directly to the school district.
Yeah, I got it. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Bateson. Mr. Mottola has a comment and a question.
Sorry, I lost you there for a second. So we're not going to know in 2 weeks. And so we're going to have to pass this budget on what we know now and what we have before us. And I thought someone said a few minutes ago that this funding isn't supposed to supplant what is in our budget right now. So I guess what I'm saying is we're just not going to know. And I think there's been talk, once we get the money, we're going to have a conversation, right, Mr. Cummings? I think you've indicated you'd have a conversation with the town bodies about what you would like to do with this money. Is that a
That's
fair
correct.
statement?
That is correct.
Okay. All right. And the $3.15 million, that's $3 million plus dollars spent over 3 calendar years, correct?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
You're welcome.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Mottola. Any further questions on page 12? Then let's move to page 13.
Okay.
Did I miss somebody?
Sorry, Jim. I had a quick question.
Yeah.
I apologize.
Go ahead.
Sorry.
Mhm.
Sorry. Yeah. Just to get back to Mr. Bateson's concerns a little bit, I wanted to sort of echo that a little. There happened to be a Connecticut, special report, fairly recently that said that, just the town alone, and I'm not sure which federal stimulus windfall this was, would be getting $29,334,891, of which K through 12 school aid, again, that's sort of not specific kind, but it does show 4,312,526 allocated to Fairfield in terms of K through 12. So I'm not sure which aid package that is, but from what I read, this is back on March 8th. That's what the federal government has so far allocated to the town, and through that designation, the Board of Ed through the K through 12 school aid. I just, those are the kinds of articles that I'll speak for myself that I know I read that where I have the same kind of concerns that Mr. Bateson expressed. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Testani. Mr. Walsh, you have a further question on this page?
Yeah, through you, Mr. Chairman, I would like to get an update on these grants to the extent there are any updates, which I'm not imagining there's going to be, but just in case there are, prior to us voting on the budgets, on this budget.
Yes, okay, so I'm looking at the budget calendar. Mr. Cummings, our last meeting before we vote, we're voting on Wednesday the 31st.
Mm-hmm.
The last meeting before we vote would be the 29th. Monday, that's a Monday.
Yeah.
And as a follow-up with departments if needed. If there's an update, that would be the time to let us know.
Okay.
On the
Put it on
29th.
calendar.
Yep, on the 29th or before, but
Okay,
definitely on the 29th. Even if the update is, there's no update.
got it.
Yeah.
All right, thank you very much.
And then just one last thing. So, this follows up with what Mr. Mottola was saying. We might get to the point where we vote on this and we don't know what's going on and whether it will have an impact on the budget, whether it won't have an impact on the budget or whatever. But we're all in this kind of together, Mr. Cummings and Ms. Vitale. I think we've worked well with this through last year as well, because if there's any savings that can be had after the budget, your budget is approved, we could, I think we could work in trying to put any savings that we might have into a non-lapsing fund or something else like that, which I know you want to have, and I think we put money in there in good faith, and I think it was spent in good faith, and I think it's down to zero again, correct?
I believe so. We're heading there.
So I just think that we're all going to have to work through this, since I don't think we're going to be getting information until after this budget process is done about what can be spent, where it can be spent, and all that other stuff. So, I don't know what else to say about it, but it is frustrating. I understand Mr. Bates' frustration, but I just don't think we're gonna have information, and we're just gonna have to play along as we go through this. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Walsh. Further questions on this page? Okay, moving on to page 13. Mr. Cummings, do you want to go through this now on your slides or through the budget book?
Whatever, perhaps it's better to try to do it in the slides if there's questions.
Yep, that is fine. So page 13, questions on page 13, which lays out the expenses and the budget drivers. So we have the benefits, we have staff salaries, operations, maintenance, and transportation highlighted for the reasons Mr. Cummings had mentioned in an earlier slide. Budget drivers, capital, instructional service, tuition, supplies, contracted services, and then other purchase services, dues and fees for a 5.19% increase. Any questions on this page, Mr. Walsh?
Mr. Cummings, I know you know this slide pretty well, but I just want to make sure I understand what you were saying, and especially the highlighted portions. So what are you saying, that because of some of the cliffs that were created in operations, maintenance, and transportation, that, like, for example, operations and maintenance of buildings, it's basically 0.87 of your 5.19 increase, so that's a kind of a large increase that normally wouldn't be there. Is that what you're saying?
That's correct, Mr. Walsh. I'm going to just jump. If you look to the next slide,
Yeah,
you can see it
I
there.
want to get there. Yep. Okay, I'm looking at it. So, are you saying on that slide that operations and maintenance and transportation are 1.56% out of the 5.19% total increase?
That's correct.
Okay. And if we didn't have this cliff, it would have been 0.17, or is in the next column? Or are you saying that because we were able to use the non-lapsing account money? I was missing that transition when you went over that form.
Okay.
So I'm just trying to understand what this shows.
Yep. So if we didn't, if we were not essentially making up for the money that was applied into the non-lapsing, and I hesitate to use this word, and I apologize in advance, but in a normal year, this would have been the 0.17.
Okay. Okay. So, and then at the very bottom, the total increase, this 2.555444, like that number, is that the amount of the non-lapsing account that we used?
That's it. That's the effect of the Ms. Mansell, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's the effect of the non-lapsing. Ms. Mansell, am I right there?
Yes, it's the effect of the portion of non-lapsing that was cut from the budget for maintenance, and then the $1 million credit that that the budget was reduced by because of the prepayment.
On the bus.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay. All right. I understand it now. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Walsh. Mr. Mottola. Then in regards to page 13, Mr. Mottola, do you have a question, or 14?
I have a question about page 13, but it's a benefits question. And Mr. Brown, if you want me to wait until we get to page 29 of the budget book, I'll ask it then. Whatever's easier, but it's a benefits question.
Okay. So
you tell me what you want.
Let me see on page 29.
I guess my question is,
On the health insurance? No, go ahead, Mr. Mottola. Go ahead and ask it.
yeah, that's benefits. So the health insurance on page 29 of the budget book, it indicates an 11.25% increase. My understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, is that there have been savings in that, found savings of about $500,000. Is that correct, Mr. Cummings?
That is correct. Ms. Mansell can speak to that in detail, but you are correct. Since that was determined after the budget was adopted by the Board of Ed.
Okay, so on summary object Q1 health insurance, that can be reduced by $500,000, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
I'm going to jump in on that. Just proceed with caution. Right now, that is the projection based on the current head count. You may recall that once we have open enrollment, it just might change, what coverage people choose. So that number might change as we move further along in the budget process. But you are correct that right now it is a projected $500,000 savings. But I think if you remember 2 years ago, the healthcare insurance number increased after the enrollment period. So just
What's the enrollment period? Is there a specific enrollment period, or is it an open type enrollment?
It's, Ms. Munsell, do you have the dates for that?
It's in the spring. When open enrollment is, it's in the spring. Usually we
Okay.
know by the end of April, beginning of May. And I'll just add to that also that these are preliminary rates, so those are also subject to change. I don't think they'll change much, but they are subject to change.
Okay.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Vitale. Thank you, Ms. Munsell.
I mean, we hope that savings is there, and when the Board of Ed adjusts the budget in May, I'm hoping that savings will be there when we make our adjustments to counteract any reductions that might be made by town bodies.
Okay.
All right, thank you.
All right, thank you.
Any further questions from you, Mr. Ratola? No? Okay. Any further questions from the board on page 13 or 14? Okay, let's go to, I'm not seeing any, let's go to page 15, changes at a glance. Just the same type of, same information
Yes.
in a different format. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions. Board of Ed, page 16. And this is just a diagram and some bullet points outlining the non-lapsing account. Mr. Walsh, you have a question?
Yeah, it was just on 15, Mr. Brown. I apologize for not getting my question into you right away. But in regards to the staff salary, I expected to see it go up with the teachers' increase being 2.4%. And it's not like the other unions aren't getting increases either. So I'm just trying to figure out how you guys got it to be 1.24%. Is it just, am I missing something? Is it just, there's other unions just getting smaller increases?
Ms. Mansell, you able to speak to that?
Yes, that is all staff salaries, not just teachers.
Okay, so the teachers are the largest number of employees, is that correct? So they're at 2.4%. Do you have any union people or other salaries are just not going up, got 0% increases?
No, but also remember when negotiations is done, those increases are based on what the staffing was at the time of negotiations. The budget is built on the staffing that we had in November.
All right. Okay. So it may be less staffing that's causing only a 1 point. I'm not disappointed to see it 1.24%, but I was just expecting it to be, in the twos.
Not less staffing, but change in staffing.
Okay.
With retirements, maybe, Ms. Munsell, and new staff coming in, perhaps?
Staff at different, yes, for both of those reasons, staff at different steps in the salary schedule.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Walsh. Any further questions on page 15? Moving on to 16. Again, just bullet points and diagrams describing the non-lapsing account and the per-year average annual expenditure. Any questions on this slide? I'm seeing none. Okay,
Smiling kids.
yes. And I would say there's most likely no questions on this slide. So we're going to go to the budget book. But before we do have a town resident with us, and I do not want to keep her here any later. So Ms. Katie Flynn, if you're with us still, if you'd like to make your comment, please do. So Mr. Cummings, can we drop the
Yeah, I'm working on it. I'm sorry.
Okay, thank you. That way I can see everybody and I
Yep,
can see if Ms. Flynn is still with
I'm
us.
here.
Get rid of the Zoom.
You're here, okay. Welcome.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Please go
Hi.
ahead with your comment.
Hi.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Katie Flynn, 204 Grandview Road. I'm speaking in support of the Fairfield Public School operating budget as approved by the Board of Education. This budget represents the needs of our students and staff after living and learning through a global pandemic. This crisis has enormously impacted the education and mental health of the school-age children of our community. Now is the time that our schools need our community's full support and funding. The increase to the Board of Education budget includes the hole from the non-lapsing account and contractual obligations that the Board of Education and Board of Finance supported and voted on together. Even if the dollars were restored to cover those obligations, this cut would still eliminate other needs articulated in this budget and by staff, some of those possibly being student allocations, transportation, social workers for our elementary school students, and a modest increase to the maintenance budget. The public schools also still have no definitives from the state on any further requirements or needs that COVID or new regulations may present in the coming school year. The Board of Education also does not operate with a contingency fund, and we have seen the effects of this over the decades when millions of dollars of allocated education dollars are reduced to cover unexpected maintenance or budgetary deficits. This can have long-lasting effects and make budget cuts like this harder to cushion. It would be incredibly short-sighted to imagine that further needs may not exist after what the public schools have experienced these past 2 school years. We also have recently seen lots of commentary on the federal dollars that the town and Board of Education will receive over the coming months and years. I want to implore the Board of Finance to not use those dollars as a way to fill a budget deficit or lessen the tax burden on residents. This goes directly against the language of the legislation, and doing so would only create budget cliffs moving forward. The reality is the town has proposed a dramatic increase in their spending and consequently the tax burden on that to citizens. The idea that the town can afford to do that while reducing the education budget as our students and staff are in a time of crisis is misaligned what I have always seen as the values of this community. Budgets ultimately are a statement of our values. We as a community must stand behind our schools, not only in words, but in actions. I implore the Board of Finance to restore the funds reduced by the Board of Selectmen and give our students and staff all they need to rebuild back better. Thank you for your time and dedication to our community and for the opportunity to give public comment. I appreciate it.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Flynn.
Thank you very much.
Yep, thank you for your comments. Okay, we're going to, that's the only live comment for tonight. We will go to the budget book and let's start on page 12. We'll just look at this briefly. This is the revenue to the town, state, and federal. And I want to see if our board has any questions in regards to the revenue. Education cost sharing remains the same, so we're expected to get 1.1 million. Excess cost has gone up or anticipated, projected to go up about 900,000. In the end, grand total revenue is $9.754 million. Are there any questions on page 12 or 13? I'm seeing none, so I'm going to move on. On page 22, 23, it outlines the major budget drivers. This was just explained through the PowerPoint presentation. And thank you, Mr. Cummings, because that was a thorough presentation and it covered these numbers. Just want to give the board an opportunity to ask any questions in regards to page 22. Okay, I'm seeing none. Let's go to page 25. Page 24, if I just go back there, that's the estimated actual expenses. That outlines again the select maintenance accounts, COVID, basically the non-lapsing account, and projected balance as of the budget that when the Board of Ed put this together on December 31st, 2020, it looks like of a $1.38 million deficit that I believe has since been adjusted. So go to page 25 and we'll go through the 11 categories. And we'll start with number 1, which is staff salaries. And that is a summary. The summary and budget highlights of staff salaries is on page 26 and 27. Any questions from the board on page 26 or 27? I'm seeing none. Let me know if I'm going too fast, if you don't have enough time to take a look and ask a question. If I don't see your hand up, I'm going to move on. Benefits. Mr. Matola asked a question about benefits. We know where we are with that. As of now, we know it is a possible moving target. Any further questions on benefits? Moving on to number 3, instructional services, which will be on page 31. Any questions on instructional services? Going on to number 4, contracted services, which will take us to page 33. Any questions on this line? Seeing none, transportation, number 5. That's on page 35. There's an increase here of 15% due to, it looks like, a contract, the first year of a 5-year contract, increase in fuel rates, and the prepayment. Any questions on transportation? Mr. Testani.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Just really quick, I don't see any change from this COVID. I guess this is that's in the previous budget. Is that fair to say? I mean, obviously we didn't have transportation costs, right? So I'm just trying to. This 16% increase was for the new budget, right? It actually decreased last year. Is that fair to say?
There's a large increase because of the $1 million cut for this year that was prepaid in 1920.
Oh, okay, got it. Thanks, Doreen.
Yep.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Testani. Now, I received a chat message that asked me to slow down. So I will slow down. And I won't move further than where we are, transportation. Matter of fact, I'll even back up. So if we go to staff salaries in green, Okay. Were there further questions on benefits? Mr. Walsh?
The life and disability insurance is just a quote we get for that it just seemed like a high increase at 5%.
That was a recommendation by Aon at the time. They are in the process of negotiating a new contract.
So is the 5% an estimate for them while they try to renegotiate the contract?
Yes.
And when will they have those numbers on the renegotiated contract? Will it be before, during the budget process, or is it going to come after?
It'll be during the budget process. And actually, I just got an email from them Friday, I believe, that I haven't had a chance to look at, but they may have, made some headway there but I haven't analyzed it.
All right. When you have analyzed that, can you send us all an email through our chairman and let us know whether that number is moved or any of the numbers that your Aon's giving you have moved?
Sure.
Thank you.
Okay, that would be on 329 again. Thank you, Mr. Walsh.
No problem.
Any further questions? Mr. Bateson?
Yeah, Jim, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, sorry. I just want to back up to staff salaries. I'm on, I don't know where, I'm on page 25. If Doreen could look at that, I just need an explanation on staff salaries actual 2019, 2020 of 111 million and the budget of 113 million. I just want to make sure that I see the asterisk there, and I want to make sure that that 111 is actual, or is that net of salaries that were moved to RLA?
That's a 1920 number. That's last year's actual?
Yeah. Yeah, correct.
So that's a year ago, is what you're saying, Ms. Munsell.
I'm sorry.
That's 1920.
Yeah, 1920, and it has an asterisk. The whole column has an asterisk. We had a budget of 113 million. The actual was 111. I just want to make sure that that 111 includes RLA salaries.
We didn't have RLA last year.
Okay, good.
Last year was a shutdown.
Okay. All right. I'm just trying to, I'm along the lines of Mr. Walsh on this with the staff salaries. From an analytics point of view, the 1.24, I don't want to kick this gift horse in the mouth because I like the gift it's giving me, but I agree with his, I don't know, I'm trying to reconcile what I'm seeing in the past with staff salaries budgeted to actual, and I understand that, given the contract year, we have the variances in between hiring, new hires will bring the cost down, but still, given the contract and the large majority of staff salaries as certified teachers, I just would have expected to see this percentage higher. I just want to make sure that we're not missing something.
Okay, yeah, just let me clarify something. The 1.24% is the percentage of the increase in the budget, increase in staff salaries as a percentage of last year's budget. So 1.24% of the 5.19 is due to staff salaries. If you go to page 27 and look at the different categories, those, the last column is the increase or decrease over budget.
There you go. Of 1.97.
Total in 1. Right.
Okay.
In total.
I get you. All right. So that gets to Mr. Walsh's point where I would expect to see that number closer to the 2.4. All right. Okay, I see that, so. All right,
Okay,
that makes
thank you.
more sense. That makes more sense to me. Thank you.
Yep, thank you for that, explaining that.
Okay, any further questions on staff salaries? Okay, or health?
Are we on benefits?
Yes.
Okay. So, can you explain to me, I'm reading your explanation for pension and retirement. It seems like 5.76 is a high amount, but that's probably the actuarially required amount, correct? For those employees that qualify, because most of the employees, the teachers' pension is paid for the state, correct?
The teachers are in teachers' retirement, right? So they're not in here.
Yeah. Can you just summarize, Ms. Munsell, because there's some people that are kind of new here, the pensions that are in here for what class of employees?
The town pension is for non-certified employees. And it's grandfathered, the date's in here somewhere. Anyone hired or on staff before August of 2017, non-certified, full-time, is in the town pension. Non-certified hired after that time are in the 401A. And teachers aren't in here at all. There's nothing in here for teachers because they pay into state teachers' retirement.
And the definition of non-certified is what?
Anyone who has to, I can take that. Anyone who has to teach under a teacher certification as licensed by the state is a certified teacher, and they're considered a member of the teachers union, and they have no choice but to pay into the state teachers retirement, and that also includes our administrators, so our building principals and all of those folks are in the same category as well.
Okay. So it'd be categories such as your janitorial staff, cafeteria employees.
Correct. Secretaries, paraprofessionals.
Secretaries. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
Our office staff, our IT workers, all of those people are the non-certified staff.
Okay. Okay. And when you say the final numbers for the 2021 will not, 21-22 will not be available until the 2020 valuation is complete, are you talking about by the company that does the actuarial work for the town of Fairfield?
Yes, Hooker and Holcomb. That's done by Hooker and Holcomb and usually given to us through the town.
Okay. So we can talk to them, I guess, when we have them before us on, I think it's the 25th of March, about that and whether that's an accurate number, because they haven't given you numbers yet. Is that correct?
Not updated ones.
Okay. When do they normally supply them, Ms. Munsell? Do they supply them before we're done with our deliberation?
I don't know if it's that early. Definitely before the budget process is done, but I'm not sure if it's in time for your vote.
Okay. And so the 5.76, did that come from Hooker and Holcomb as the most accurate number they can give you at the time, or the Town of Fairfield's finance department? Like, how did you come up with the 5.76?
Okay, if you go at the bottom of the page, on page 29, the first line that says town pension, the proposed budget, the 1.99 is what was given to us by Hooker and Holcomb. Everything else is our own calculation.
All right. Okay. So you just take the town pension number and then you add some of these other categories that you can make the calculation on.
Correct.
So the employees that were hired after August 2017 are in a 401A. So you can make that calculation based on their salary levels and things like that.
Correct.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for that explanation. I appreciate it.
Mhm.
But we'll follow up, Mr. Brown. I'm going to be following up with Hooker and Holcomb, I guess, on a more accurate number when we meet on March 25th.
25th.
Yeah.
Yep. Thank you, Mr. Walsh. Okay. On instructional services. Any questions?
Yeah.
Mr. Walsh?
The increase in the pupil personnel services, can you explain that a little bit better than that? Anything more to add other than that short paragraph?
Yeah, I could give an explanation. This is Rob Mancusi again. Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Mr. Mancusi.
Yes, so you'll see on page 75, it's broken down a little bit more in terms of our professional expenses. What the professional expenses other, you have professional expenses, nursing, and professional expenses, speech. That's broken down into 3 areas. When prior to this year or this budget book, it was all encompassed into one. The professional expenses and why it's has increased. That's a lot of our instructional support that we contract for. We have had several students with learning recovery needs since July 1st that we've had to contract with staff for specialized reading support or specialized math support. We've had an increase in behavioral consultations for students as well as in neuropsychological evaluations. Those are a few of the services under that professional expense. And in the other area where you will see significant increases is in our occupational therapy and our physical therapy lines, which currently in that area we are working with the town we have put out to bid a proposal for those services.
On the occupational therapy, because it went up by 2679, is that a surprise for you, or is it just a lot more students needing those services?
Our OT and our PT services have been increasing rather significantly over the past few years. We're trying to, analyze and get a handle on why that is. There is an increase in services for students with those needs, but we're looking at more efficient ways to potentially deliver those services. That's part of the reason why we're working with town officials. We went out to bid and we'll be reviewing those shortly.
Okay, for both of those in previous years, were we using like one vendor or specific vendor for some of that stuff, or were you always using multiple vendors?
For occupational and physical therapy, we have, for the past 36 years, Fairfield has been using Rehab Associates. They have been our service provider for OT and PT.
Yeah, and it's never been put out to bid. They just always got it for the last 30 years straight?
I can't speak to the past 36 years. I know, this is my 4th year. My first year we did have, when I got here, there was already a 1-year contract signed. At the end of my first year, we signed an extension of a 2-year contract. So, because of our concerns with the rise in costs, we want to see if, we just wanted to see if we can still get the same high quality service for more cost effective price. So that's why we went out to bid.
Mr. Walsh, let me just add that we did say this year that we were going to put it out to bid because we were concerned with the rising cost.
Hey, how does that work with our purchasing policies? Don't we, one company can get this for 30-something years without it going out to bid? How does that work?
I don't know what our purchasing policies are. You know, we did meet with Mr. Foley from the town last spring to talk about professional services in the area of special education. Some services are very specialized and don't require going out to bid, it's my understanding. We have even our, you will see our professional expenses for our speech services that we also put out to bid. What that is if we're unable to meet the IEP needs of students with speech and language services with our existing FTE and we're unable to fill open positions, we're forced to contract services. Speech is a shortage area. So what we've been doing is we do use multiple vendors for that because it is such a shortage area and it's sometimes very difficult to find folks to cover long-term leaves, to cover maternity leaves, to cover retirements, or to fill openings. So.
Okay. I mean, I guess if we've been using the same company for 30-something years, there's, you know, I guess whatever their price is, we've been paying without any competition. Now, I'm not saying that there is competition, and I'm certainly not saying that you're not doing a good job, because you seem to think you're doing a good job, and I trust you on that. But what I am saying is that it's kind of why we require requests for proposals, so that, you know, there can be some competition in this, and it keeps, you know, vendors, even vendors we've had for a long time that are doing great work, it makes them look at what number they're going to send us every year to stay competitive on it. And when I'm looking at this budget, just at the top, I just want to be clear. So the professional, and you might have said this, you had the other. The other now seems to be broken out into nursing and speech. Is that what happened? Because it looks about the same number.
Well, it is. It's breaking them down because
just breaking it down, which is great. Yeah, that's great. But I just want to be confirmed one thing: occupational therapy and physical therapy. There was no additional need like this. Hasn't going up in price because you've said, hey, we're going to have 20% more cases or 5% more cases, so you're going to have to adjust your bid. You're basically asking for what we had the previous year.
There is an increase in the number of evaluations. There's been an increase in the number of students who qualify for services. We've been looking at practices and been speaking with our service providers who do provide excellent service, but we have been expressing concern with the rising costs, particularly in those areas.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Mancusi. I appreciate your help.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Walsh. Ms. Charlton.
Thank you, Chairman Brown. Sorry, I wanted to ask a question before we had jumped off the pension on page 29. And Ms. Munsell, so the $1,990,000 for the non-certified staff, how many people is that, roughly?
It's about 260, around 260.
260, okay. And then the 401A, rough numbers?
About 250.
250, you said?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So we have as many new people roughly since 2017 as we do. Oh, but the pension would include retirees as well, right?
Correct. Yeah.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Charlton. Any other questions on page 31? Okay, contracted services, page 33. I guess we should ask on the 273% personnel recruitment expenses, the correct teacher residency program. Oh, okay. Okay, very good. Mr. Walsh?
So that personal recruitment expenses, that's for that one residency teacher you were talking about earlier, that program you're gonna try? It's
That's correct.
one- Okay, that's why it's really not a lot
To
of
recruit.
dollars.
Yep.
Okay, okay. And is that something you're just
All
gonna
right.
pilot that program, or, and then you're gonna see how it works out? Is that something you think will be lasting? And, you know, if the pilot works out all right?
We're hoping so, Mr. Walsh. This was a program that was, and Ms. DC can speak to it in more detail than I can, but it was a program that was implemented, I believe, starting last year in the Hartford area. It's now become a statewide program. So our hope is that this is part of the state's initiative to increase diversity in the instructional teaching force. I'm hoping as well that there might be some state funding put behind their efforts, and hopefully this figure might come down as.
Okay. But is this like a program, I'm just trying to get a sense like what's gonna happen in the future. Is this like a pilot program that we're trying and it's one teacher, and then it's gonna expand, you'll see how the program works, and just like that literacy program that starts with 7, but we make it up to 80 some odd students,
Yes.
is it something that is gonna be going on like that? Is that the thought process?
That is the thought process, to learn
Okay.
from one, make sure
Yep.
you can do everything better, and then hopefully add.
Okay, and is that something the state's guiding you on the numbers, or is it something that we would decide on the numbers of how big the program grows to?
That's our choice.
Your choice. Okay, good. Okay, great. If you can update us next year, that'd be great.
Yep, absolutely.
Thank you. Excellent.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Walsh. On transportation, we reviewed, but any further questions? Seeing none, tuition on page 35. Increase of about 5.95%, almost 6%, total 5.67%. Looks like the number of students is staying the same, right, Mr. Mancusi? No increase in students in this program?
Excuse me, we are projecting an increase in the number of students, tuition students for next year. We're also, though, to offset that cost, we're projecting a $900,000 difference in terms of that excess cost reimbursement between this year and next year. Part of next year's increase is also due to the change in the law where we're now required students no longer age out at 21. We have to keep them till age 22. So that's an additional cost of $367,000.
Okay. Any questions on this line? Mr. Walsh?
Mr. Mancusi, so without that change in the law, you probably would have been a negative number on that? A negative increase? I'm sorry.
Well, we would have been closer to a lesser increase, yes, because we do have many projected students graduating this year.
Okay. Is that a number based on some of these programs that you're developing that we talked about earlier? So I don't really want to recreate the wheel on that and, you know, hold us up. But do you see that going down over time as we develop programs in-house? Continue to develop programs in-house? Or are these just students that are very severe in both their disabilities that we can't support that in-house?
Well, there's both. You know, obviously we do have, we talked about like our medically fragile or our really cognitively impaired kids that we do have difficulty maintaining appropriate programming for in district, or the cost of programming in district. These are our highest cost kids. And then on the other end of it, it's, you know, we struggle with high school kids and with mental health. Kids who have difficulty maintaining safety, kids who are extremely psychiatrically impaired and need a greater level of support than we can safely provide in district. But again, we build in-district programs to meet the needs of our students so we can maintain them in district to the greatest extent possible.
Okay. All right, and then on the magnet school, why does the population continue to go down? Does anybody have any thoughts on that? It says that in your description, it says the enrollment continues to decline for the past few years. Is that because people are not happy with the magnet schools they're going to, or is there, you know, I'm not hearing a lot of magnet school talk anymore. A couple of years ago, it was a lot of talk about it, and a lot of talk about, you know, the technology one or whatever. And I'm not sure whether I'm aging out of not hearing about this stuff anymore, or whether it's just, but it seems to be as though you're saying that enrollment there is kind of going down. So
That's correct, Mr. Walsh. I would tell you that the aquaculture program in Bridgeport still remains popular,
all right,
but the other programs are not as popular.
okay,
Mr. Walsh, do you mind if I follow up on that, Mr. Brown?
that's fine.
This is Jack, that's fine. I just want to echo something Mr. Walsh was just discussing, because in the same paragraph to Mr. Cummings, I just have a quick question. It says to get to Mr. Walsh's point that the school enrollment continues to decline, yet the rates have been increased and recommended, and overall, we are budgeting for the same number of students. So I guess I'm a little confused. Are the numbers going down and we're budgeting the same dollars? I'm a little confused by that statement.
There's two different, Ms. Mansell, jump in if I get this wrong, but there's a couple different ways that the programs charge tuition. Trumbull, not Trumbull, excuse me, the Bridgeport Aquaculture Program charges a rate for X number of kids. So it isn't a per pupil rate. It's kind of a pocket rate or pool rate. Other programs charge a rate for however many kids might be involved.
I see, I got you, okay,
So
makes sense.
aquaculture is a better value, I guess, is one way to look at it.
Right, okay, thanks, Mr. Cummings, I appreciate it.
Yep.
Okay, any further questions on this topic?
Sorry, Jim, didn't mean to throw you off, I just wanted to follow up on your question.
No, okay. I do want to follow up on a revenue question when we're done, Mr. Brown, if you don't mind.
Sure. Okay, so we are at other purchase services. Hold on, I have to get to that myself. Any questions on this page? Going to page 39, supply. Mr. Walsh?
Is the postage number going down only because we're starting to email everything out, or is it just, is there a reason? Because I know the postal rates haven't gone down. It seems to be going down by like 20%.
I don't know, Ms. Mansell, do you have any insight on that one?
Yeah, we're doing, you're right, much more electronic communication.
Okay. That's good.
Further questions? Okay, next topic, supplies, text, materials, page 39. Mr. Walsh.
So in previous years, we've seen like major increases sometimes in textbooks and other things as you go in different directions with your programming and things like that. It seems like, well, textbooks is way down, it's 36% off. And then, you know, is there just no new initiatives going on in certain areas that require textbooks, or is more things being done electronically now that you don't need to buy textbooks as much as you did?
No, I would say, Mr. Walsh, this is more the better way to think about this. This is a postponement. We were held up. Our curriculum revision calendar for the last couple of years has been thrown off because of essentially staff availability to do the curriculum work during the summer. We were not able to bring staff in last summer. We don't expect we're going to be able to have staff available this summer. Staff are just not ready, for that type of work. So we're going to be, you're going to see increases in the textbook account in the next few years particularly because math first one out of the gate, and we expect that we're going to see some revisions in our math textbooks.
All right. Thanks for that explanation. And that was going to be, and thanks for covering that, because that's where I was going to go next. I'm like, is this a long-term plan? We're not going to need textbooks being purchased, but it makes sense what you're talking about based on things you've had to deal with. So I appreciate you giving that summary. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Walsh. Any other questions on this page? Okay, we're going to go to item number 9, operations and maintenance of buildings, page 41, which, Mr. Papa George, I think would be your page here. We have one item going up 3,400%, which might be a record, except right underneath it, there's an item going up 48,000%. So
yes, please ask.
It has to do with COVID, PPE, and what have us. But if you could just give us a rundown on what's going on here.
So those increases are because of the non-lapsing. So you're seeing the increase go up from last year to this year for spending. There are some costs associated with COVID, new filter pricing we have, a new HVAC preventative maintenance program. We also have our building automated controls, preventative maintenance in there now. So that's another initiative. And then another initiative that you'll see in there is our grounds. We did a slight increase with because we're trying to start a preventative maintenance program on our trees around our buildings to prevent storm damage to buildings from older trees that need pruning and care. So those are some of the highlights that you'll see that why you see some that increase in there.
So you take care of that and not DPW?
Which?
The trees and did they?
Correct.
I guess, okay.
The DPW does assist with some of that. If it's an emergency work, they will come out and take care of it right away for us. But if it's a routine maintenance, a lot of the tree work we do ourselves.
Okay. Questions from the board? Mr. Walsh.
Mr. Papa George, can you just talk about the utilities? I'm like reading your explanation and read it, but I know you didn't use as much utilities last year because of the closures, but are prices just not going up for, gas, water, electricity, heating fuel? I know we don't really use a lot of heating fuel, but.
We do receive the pricing from the town for our utilities, and that's how we base our budgets.
Okay. So, like electricity, you say that the town negotiated a price at a negative increase, is that correct?
Well, we calculate building usage also and use the average based on how much we've used over the last few years. We're also in the process of, we've just taken on board for a sample a utilities monitoring company that will help us better understand the trends within the buildings and give us much better numbers moving forwards with budgeting for utilities.
Okay. And then the new the new telephone system that the town supplied implemented is saving money too?
I'm not familiar with I don't cover the phones any longer, so I can't speak to that. But yes, I would imagine there is a savings that we're not paying for POTS lines any longer.
Yeah. All right. Yeah, we did the same at our office, so it saved a lot of money. So I know what you're talking about. All right. It just seems like I wasn't expecting to see a decrease, but that's a good thing. So that's great.
Thank you, Mr. Walsh. Any further questions on operations and maintenance? Okay, seeing none, we'll go to capital outlay on page 43. We have technology going up 73%. There is an explanation and an outline on page 157, I believe. So why don't we take a look at page 157, and who will speak to this, Mr. Cummings?
We have Dr. Parrish can speak to this tonight.
Okay, Dr. Parrish?
Are there specific questions that you all have, or you just want me to review what's written in the budget book?
Yeah, well, just the increase.
So the increase in the tech capital is primarily due to hardware refresh that needs to happen. There are a number of laptops that are have been distributed throughout the district, both staff and student laptops. Some of the student laptops are ones that are used for some of the more advanced classes. Well, these laptops are beyond the lifespan that is set by the manufacturer, some of which have been failing, and our IT department have been trying to do what they can to support replacement of those items as they can, but understanding that there is a need to do a replacement on those laptops, as well as some of the desktop computers that are in some of the labs at our high school that support our graphic arts and digital photo design courses. So some of our specialty courses that utilize specific software that can't be loaded on machines other than a Mac and some of the digital media classes, but the others are just traditional laptops that are well beyond their lifespan. So that's the bulk of the budget increase. In addition to servers, it includes servers that need to be repaired or replaced, projector systems, interactive display boards, which have gotten a lot of use over this past year, just because of the need to support both our in-person and learners at home. So there is a need to replace these items as they basically go beyond their lifespan and start to fail.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. Further questions on the reason for the increase? Or any question in regards to this line item? Mr. Walsh, then Mr. Testani?
Dr. Parrish, thank you for that summary. Is any more work being done to supply any type of hardware for like remote learning, or was that all done together and it's all set? Is there any expansion that's necessary, or we finished it all last year and we're all set with that?
So I would say that there is some inclusion of Khajiit hotspots in this budget, and that's used to support remote learners who do not have access to Wi-Fi within the home. So ensuring that we have equity across our student population. So there is some inclusion of that. The cost of those Khajiit hotspots have gone up. They went up from 9,600 to 25,000. So same number of hotspots, the prices it has increased. And we are unsure as to whether or not the state will continue to offer internet services to students in the next coming year. So without that guarantee, and even with it, we still need to provide access to students who are otherwise would not have access to Wi-Fi. In terms of like devices, we did use some of our state funding or that we received. The initial ESSER grant was used to purchase Chromebooks for grades 3 through 5. Those, I think the final shipment just came in last week, so we haven't launched one-to-one in grades 3 through 5 yet, but there is not, inclusion of devices in the current budget.
Okay. And do many of the students use the Chromebooks or whatever to do remote learning, or do they support it, and do they use it?
Yes, the Chromebooks do support remote learning. They're also utilized within the classroom themselves. So as you know, the 612 has been one-to-one for a number of years. Mm-hmm. And so pre-COVID, they were utilizing the Chromebooks for various in-class as well as home instructional programming.
Okay. Have you seen any uptick in now that everyone, well, for a period of time, people were just all home remote learning, any uptick in maintenance costs of these Chromebooks being at home and possibly being in sometimes a rougher environment than in the school?
I mean, I would say that we have had to replace several screens. It's something that we do budget for. It's not included in this part of the budget, but there is a certain amount of money that is included to cover the cost of replacing screens that might get damaged, not necessarily just at home, but that can happen during the course of being in school as well. So,
Yeah.
because these are devices that the kids carry around with them during the course of the school day.
Okay, so you haven't seen any uptick really that would be noticeable because accidents happen in school just as much as they happen at home.
Right, we can't connect it directly to use at home.
Yeah, all right. I'm looking at your larger projects, your maintenance projects. Oh no, are we on that now? Is this part of this section as well?
Larger maintenance project, which page are you
Page
on?
150, page 159, Dr. Parrish, I'm sorry. Maybe I'm on an area I'm not supposed to be on right now. It's just when I was, maybe that's to be covered. That's to be covered later on. Thank you. Does not have to do with technology, so I apologize. I followed the page to the end and just kept going. So thank you very much, Dr. Parrish, for answering my question.
You're welcome.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Wall. Mr. Testani, and then I think I missed Mr. Bates, and so I'll go back to you, Ed, after Mr. Testani.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Hi, Dr. Parrish, how are you?
Good, how are you?
Just a quick plug for the Chromebooks. I have a 7-year-old step-granddaughter, and I can almost understand the Chromebook. So and she uses it every day. So I think it's a great tool. I was just curious on some of the equipment. Do we go, is it a bid process? Is there one supplier? How do we get the equipment itself?
So our director of IT, she is a part of a network of IT directors within the state, and they typically will share that information in terms of the best supplier for certain things. So there's certain devices that they do get from specific suppliers because the cost is lower.
So you're saying, just to be clear, none of these items go out for bid. Is that, did I understand that right?
I do not believe that they go out to bid.
And I'm curious, do they all come with certain warranties? It sounds like most of the things that had issues were out of warranty. Would that be fair to say?
Out of warranty or things that wouldn't necessarily be covered by a warranty. So drops and, that type of thing wouldn't necessarily be covered by a traditional warranty. But if there was a failure to the computer that had something to do with the software or the hardware inside of the computer that wasn't the result of just, everyday wear and tear, then those things would be covered depending on the length of the warranty.
And this may be a quick question more for Mrs. Vitale or someone on the Board of Ed, but I was just curious. I think at one point it had been considered to ask parents to perhaps have some kind of insurance policy that the Board of Ed would support or something to help when there are these, lack of a better word, problems at home with some of the equipment. Is that something that's been implemented? Is it something that's still in the planning stages? Or I'm just curious. Obviously we don't want to make it onerous on parents, but at the same time, I know there are other school systems that have implemented a similar program.
Yeah, Mr. Testani, I can answer that, and it's a great question. We were in the formative stages of putting something together last spring, and we held off on it, given where we are. But I think you're absolutely right. I think most districts have a relatively low-cost insurance program. If families can't afford it, there's a sliding scale to support people. But it's something that I think we really have to consider, particularly as we widen the distribution of machines.
That's great. Thank you, Mr. Cummings. And if you wouldn't mind giving us an update on that as you perhaps develop that into the future, I think that would be helpful. And perhaps some of these costs could come down a little bit in terms of the repairs cost to the Board of Ed.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Thanks, Jim.
All right, thank you, Mr. Testani. Mr. Bateson.
Yeah, Jim, I had something on supplies and materials, but it was asked and answered already.
Okay. So you're okay. No other questions. So that really Dues and fees, really no increase there. And that covers page 25. Before we move on for good, does anybody have any further questions on that section? Mr. Walsh.
I had a revenue question. We don't need to do it now, but we can do it.
That's okay,
later.
because after this, we're going to go into the backup and support information. So you want to go back up to revenue?
Sure, yeah.
Would that be on page 12 or?
It'd be on page 12.
Okay.
And it was the tuition, when we went through the tuition budget, that just made me think of it, and I just went quickly back. So, you know, I know we received tuition for the open choice program, and I've just noticed it going down. Is there a reason why it's going down, or less people participating, or is it some other reason, or our tuition fees gone down, or something else?
Mr. Walsh, we didn't increase enrollment in that this year. I think there was many districts in the same position. We were given the concerns with the pandemic. There was kind of a pullback across the state in many communities around this. So there was less students involved.
Okay. And that you're budgeting for less students to be involved this coming year?
That's correct.
Okay. I just wanted to ask a quick question. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Walsh. So we're going to go to support information section, which is towards the back. And we'll start with total staffing by funding source. Just so we're all clear on the funding, the FTEs for 2021 and then 21-22. So on this page, it may be on page 148 or 149, whichever is easiest. Just want to make sure we're reading this right. So can someone walk us through the staffing and the difference of the total positions? Because it looks like between total staff by certified and non-certified, there's 23.675 proposed less, but I want to make sure I'm reading this right.
Yeah. Ms. DC, are you able to do that?
I would defer to Miss Munsell because she's the one who created this chart, so I'm not quite sure exactly what her numbers are.
Okay. Page 148, column 3, we had to break out our actual FTEs between BOE FTEs and RLA FTEs, and you'll see we had budgeted 34.9 FTEs that were used for RLA. And then there was the additional RLA staff that we had to hire, and then the grant. So that I'm getting an echo. So that's just an explanation of the actual. For next year, there's a difference of 3.45 position between budget and proposed. And you'll have to add the two, the 38.8 and the 34.9. That is the difference between actual and proposed. You have to account for the split between RLA and budget. This was FTEs were very complicated this year, to say the least. And the lower bottom right-hand side, there's a total staffing difference of 0.35. That includes all funding sources. There's 0.85 in the operating budget, if you go up 2 lines from that. The, page 149 just gives a little bit more detail on funding between grants and the Board of Ed budget by category. But it's the same information.
Okay, so total FTEs for the proposed budget would equate to 1540.05.
Yes.
And then the total approved FTEs for 2020 and 2021 was 1539.70.
Correct.
And then we have 1563.725. And that means because of the RLA?
That's
Because what we have is 1563 there, but that's because of RLA?
yes. Yeah.
Okay. And that's 24.4 positions, I think is what you're saying.
Yes.
We need an additional 24.4 to staff the RLA, which we will not need in the next coming budget.
Correct.
Okay, so with that, it brings it to basically where we were last year, 0.35 difference.
Correct.
Okay. Are there any questions on page 148 or 149 from the board? Basically, there's not an increase in FTEs from budget between this budget 2021 and 21-22. Once we adjust for the RLAs staff. So I don't want to move too fast. I want to make sure that we're all good on page 148, 149. We're good? Okay. So if we move along, we took care of page 156 and 7 with the technology. We'll go to page 159 on the maintenance projects. Mr. Walsh, I believe you had a question on this page? Just because you mentioned that you would come back to it. Okay.
So the cafeteria expansion joint project, what is that?
That is at Woods Elementary School, down the, if you walk into the cafeteria from the main hallway, down the right side of that entire room, there's a expansion joint that when they put the expansion on, they tiled over it with VCT tile, and it's now separated and made kind of a lip there, which is causing a safety concern, and people are tripping on it at this point. So we would be going in and adding a kind of like you see if you walk through the mall, a metal plate across it to make it a smooth transition between the two areas.
Okay. That makes sense. None of these projects are very big projects this year.
No.
So, all right.
No further questions?
Further questions from me, Mr.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Walsh. And so on the last page, gives the utility rate comparison. Want to make sure there's no questions on utilities. And that will finish up the book if there's not. Unless, of course, someone feels I missed a page. No, okay, I think we covered it in pretty good detail between the PowerPoint and this book. So if there's no further questions, we can move on to the next item on the agenda, which is Health and Welfare Services, page 136 in the budget book. And who will speak to this budget item, Mr. Cummings?
I will, Rob Mancusi. Is that okay, Mike?
Absolutely, Mr. Mancusi, absolutely.
I'm sorry.
No, that's okay.
Yeah, this is the health and welfare grant that we get from the town to fund our child find or responsibilities to locate, identify, evaluate, and identify students with disabilities within Fairfield that attend one of our private schools. We don't service the kids, but legally we are required to, identify them, evaluate them, and identify them if they qualify for services and inform their families that if they were to attend the public schools, they would be eligible for services. So this pays for a portion of the special ed coordinator, school psychologist, social worker, special ed teacher, salaries, as well as travel to the various schools and some supplies and materials.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Mancusi. Any questions on this item? Okay, seeing none, we'll turn back a page to 135, and we have the private school bus transportation, which is down 19% from 1 year ago, mainly due to the bus contract. So who can explain this item to us?
I believe that's gonna be Miss Mansell.
Yeah, I don't know if Jared wants to say anything about it first. We provided the information, but we left the decision up to the town.
No, go ahead. This is your operation and your analysis. So
I can tell no one's really excited to discuss this budget, but it should be a good one. It's down 20%. Somebody should be
Right.
wanting to jump on this one.
We were able to, because of ridership this year, we were able to decrease the number of buses, mostly on the non-public side. So what we did was we provided the town with the ridership from last year in October and ridership from this year. I guess it sounds like the schools tell transportation how many students they expect need transportation, and then in the past, transportation would just route those students. But this year, the ridership was not up to what the schools thought the transportation would be. So we were able to reduce 8 full buses, which is the reduction of the $600 and almost $20,000. So we left it up to the town to, okay, do you want to take a chance and reduce these 8 buses? And assume that the ridership will be the same next year, or not. And apparently they decided to cut all 8 buses.
I wonder if there's been savings in this budget in years past, and so they felt safe in not budgeting as much.
That's probably fair to say. I think we've heard over the years that, a lot of buses we're seen traveling down the road without students in it. And we do have a new transportation supervisor. He's been here 2 years now and has more experience with the town. But we do want the town to know that, there's the potential that if ridership goes up for some reason because kids weren't riding this year, but just because of COVID, and it goes back up next year, that there's a risk here for additional expense.
Okay. Mr. Walsh.
If you went from October to this past October, could the ridership be down because of COVID? I mean, 20.
It could be.
I mean, that's what I'm getting concerned about, is that if you can do that compare, if some of the private schools are out, but they're doing remote learning, they don't, I understand why you don't need the buses, and we could potentially get bid on this when they come back to school this coming October under this budget.
Okay, let me give you, in October 1920, the request for transportation, so the information that the schools provided to transportation of the number of students that would need transportation, so this is October of 19, before, pre-COVID, they said that 679 students needed transportation. The actual ridership in October of 2019 was 265. This year, they said 280 would need transportation, and the ridership was 177.
Okay. I just think that there's a possibility of there being a severe COVID influence on these numbers, and that, you know, I guess, Mr. Schmidt, the town's gonna have to suck it up if they all come back. All these chickens come back and need rides.
Mr. Schmidt.
Yeah, so we recognize that there could be some risk here. We did get the analysis from the Board of Education, and we have seen the actual numbers from this year that are down, which we'll be reporting on in our next quarterly report. So the actual is way down this year as well, and and based on the what Ms. Munsell was saying about the October 19 numbers, we thought it wasn't out of the realm of possibility that this could play out this way.
All right, would we be able to get any numbers from the transportation, whoever handles the department and scheduling, of whether, since like Fairfield Prep has gone back this month about a week ago, whether there's been many more requests for transportation, so we can get some type of handle on this, whether we're going to need to make an adjustment here?
Sure.
I'd just like to see whether there's been an uptick in people making requests for transportation now that some of the schools are going back. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Walsh. Any further questions on this topic?
I don't.
Mr. Mottola?
I don't want to belabor it, but I think Mr. Schmidt's right that the comparison is October 2019, when I think the number was, they thought they were going to have 600 students needing buses, and it was down in the 200. So to me, this number's right on the money. Maybe I'm wrong, but that's pre-COVID numbers we're talking about, October 2019. So yeah, we should keep an eye on it, but I don't think we're going to have to change this number. Thanks.
Okay, so just a little more information just to be sure, and won't hurt us. So if you can just follow up, Mr. Schmidt. But Mr. Mottola, I hear what you're saying. I hear what Mr. Walsh is saying. We just want to be sure. It's a pretty big drop off. And you know, it's not like it's 1 or 2 buses, it's 8. It's going to be tough to make up if it's wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So that concludes tonight with the Board of Ed. We are back on Thursday, but we want to thank the Board of Ed for your presentation and appreciate you being here. We have some follow-up items for 329. And if we have any questions, further questions, if the board has any further questions for the Board of Ed that may come up before then, you can forward them over to me, and I will make sure I get them over to the Board of Ed and share the answers with the whole Board of Finance. With that, we'll go to item number 4, which is to adjourn. Can I have a motion to adjourn? Mr. Testani, seconded by Mr. Walsh. All those in favor? Say aye. That is unanimous. Thank you, everybody.
Good night,
Everybody.
Good night.
Have a good night.